Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Raglan rezoning hearing. My name's Phil Mitchell. I'm chairing this hearing today. I'll just ask the panel to briefly introduce themselves, and then we'll just talk, and everybody else that's on the call, and then we'll just do a few housekeeping matters and then get stuck into things. So if the panel could introduce themselves briefly, please, and then the staff, and then the others.
Good morning, I'm Jan Sedgwick. I'm an independent commissioner and also a councillor on the Waikato District Council.
Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning, Janet Gibb, councillor for Waikato District Council, but appointed as an independent.
Good morning, I'm Diane Fulton. I'm a former Waikato District Councillor, but I'm an independent commissioner.
Morena, Linda Tiaho, I'm an independent commissioner.
Morena koutou, Will Marg, independent commissioner.
Paul Cooney, Deputy Chair, independent commissioner and lawyer.
Thank you, everyone. If the staff could just do likewise quickly, please.
Good morning, I'm Sandra Kelly. I'm the Senior Project Coordinator for the District Plan Review.
Morena, I'm Carolyn Rett, assisting Waikato District Council and a policy planner.
And planner for the council for the Raglan zoning topic.
Thank you. All right, could we just quickly go around the room for the others that are present, please, just so that we know who's who?
Good morning, sir. Brianna Parkinson. I'm appearing for Rangatahi this morning and will be joined by others when we get closer to our presentation.
Thanks, Ms. Parkinson.
Good morning, I'm Hannah Julian. I'm presenting on behalf of Philip Barrett for the Elmer's Development Limited submission.
Thank you.
Kia ora, I'm Miffy Foley from Waikato Regional Council and I'll be presenting later this morning.
Thanks, Ms. Foley, welcome.
Morena koutou, Alex Devine, Legal Counsel for Kaingaora, just here observing today.
Thanks, Ms. Devine.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, it's Bernard Brown.
Morning, Mr. Brown, you've got Ms. Hughes with you as well, I believe.
I have Ms. Hughes with me as well.
Morning.
Morning.
I think we've got Mr. Lang there, I think, but he's not visible. No, he's not there, is it?
Yeah, I think he's just gone, unfortunately. Must be having connection issues.
He's a lawyer, he's probably just getting into the office.
He's not on till after lunch anyway, so maybe he's just got a bit shy. All right, just by way of background, I think most of the people on this call have been involved in these Zoom hearings previously, but just to, oh, there's Mr. Lang back again, I think. Can you hear us, Mr. Lang? I think we'll just note that Mr. Lang's there, but suggest that he gets his connection checked out before he's due to appear this afternoon. I'm not sure if you can hear us, Mr. Lang, or not, but we can't hear or see you. So let's just move along. Most of you, as I've said, have been involved in these Zoom hearings before. What I would ask you to do is, if you're not speaking, if you could turn your video off and your sound off, that just keeps the broadband width active. And when it's your turn to speak, then obviously liven your connection back up again. That would be appreciated. Probably the most important thing to remind everybody of is that we have read the submissions, the evidence, the legal submissions where they've been proffered, the summary statements and so forth. So what we're asking everybody to do today is to focus on the highlights package of their information, to summarize what it is their concerns are or their wishes are, and in particular what they want the panel to do in terms of the submission points that they've made. We're not at all enthusiastic about people reading vast chunks of pre-read material, and if people do go down that route, we'll just politely ask them to please move on with a little bit more speed. I think Mr. Lang might have conquered the technology, or he's in the process of doing it. We can see him in that rather illustrious rogues gallery behind him. But I don't think he can hear us. No, he's really in trouble now. He's putting the glasses on. We can't hear you, Mr. Lang, but we can see you. So I think we'll just carry on. So I don't need to repeat what I've just said about keeping it to the point and keeping it focused. We'd appreciate that. For those of people, there's a few people that are lay submitters that will be presenting to us today. Just remind you that, that whilst this might seem formal and a little bit intimidating, please just be as relaxed as you can. We're not going to bite anybody's head off. We're simply here to listen to what you've got to tell us. And if there's something that we don't quite understand or we'd like you to amplify, we'll just ask you to do that. So please take that on board. And I think without further ado, that's all we need to do by way of introduction. So I think we'll ask Ms. Buckingham if she could summarise the key aspects of her Section 42A report. Thank you, Ms. Buckingham.
Chair, so I have an opening statement from yesterday. Would you like me to go through that?
Yes, I think that would be helpful, please.
Okay, and I'll just see if I can share my screen for the images. Can you see a map at the moment?
Yes, we can, thanks.
So good morning, Chair, Commissioner and submitters. My name is Emily Buckingham. I am the 42A reporting planner for Raglan Zone Extents. So Raglan is a small West Coast harbour town located approximately 43 kilometres west of Hamilton, with a population of about 4,300 people and approximately 2,100 dwellings. The population grows in the peak summer months due to a large number of holiday homes and short-term rental properties. An annual population growth rate of over 1% per year is projected for Raglan over the next 10 years. And as shown on this map, the township is primarily zoned as residential. No substantial changes have been made to its zoning through the proposed Waikato District Plan compared to the operative District Plan. No new growth areas have been added. However, Flax Cove, Lorenzen Bay and Rangatahi Peninsula have remaining development capacity. The Rangatahi Peninsula was zoned as residential in 2015 and was the subject of a separate district plan hearing last year. It is now in the early stages of development and is expected to accommodate at least 500 to 550 dwellings once completed. This is currently the primary active growth area for Raglan. The key infrastructure is also labelled on this figure, the water source here and the wastewater treatment plant here. An increase to the consented volumes of water take and or additional water storage will be required to service any significant growth. The Raglan wastewater treatment plant has a resource consent renewal currently in progress and requires an upgrade to cater for population growth. The upgrade is budgeted for in the long-term plan, both the current one and the draft one. The topic of Raglan rezoning received 15 original submission points and 23 further submission points. Additionally, the Kainga-Ora submission seeking medium density rezoning in a number of towns applies to land within Raglan. Generally, submissions seek site-specific residential upzoning, with one seeking retention of the notified zone. 2 submissions seek to rezone large areas of rural land to allow for future urban residential use. A few submissions relate to business lane location. Future Proof 2017 set indicative urban limits for Raglan, which included Rangatahi Peninsula and some greenfields lands in Raglan West. These are shown on figure 2 here. Future Proof 2017 did not identify any shortfall of dwellings for Raglan. However, recent growth projections show higher population growth than what was predicted in Future Proof. There are now differing opinions as to whether or not Raglan will have a shortfall of dwellings compared to the NPSUD demand. I'll discuss this later. The Waikato 2017 map for Raglan is shown here in figure 3. 6 residential growth cells are shown in orange. 2 of these are not zoned for residential development in the proposed plan. Afon Opoturu here and Te Hutuai, which is a 30+ year time frame, and this one 10 to 30 years. These are located to the southwest of the existing township on currently rural land. Waikato 2070 also shows the town centre expanding to the south over the next 3 to 10 years over existing residential development, and generally being 2-storey with mixed business and residential uses. In my view, Raglan does not currently meet the definition of urban environment in the NPSUD. However, the NPSUD requirement to provide sufficient development capacity applies across the Waikato district because Waikato District Council is a Tier 1 local authority. Future Proof 2017 has specified that Raglan is one of the 6 towns that 80% of the district's growth is to be accommodated within. Therefore, regardless of whether or not Raglan is an urban environment, I consider it important to provide sufficient capacity to meet demand for dwellings. Proposed District Plan Hearing 16 Raglan in June 2020 addressed many submissions declaring that Raglan has a special character. Post-hearing, Council was directed to report on how the proposed plan might better reflect the special character of Raglan in collaboration with submitters. This report was completed in December 2020 and recommends that any new buildings in the Raglan Special Character Area, comprising all business town centre, and residential zones, excluding Rangatahi, that require a restricted discretionary consent be assessed for effects on character. A new objective, policy, and matters for discretion have been prepared to implement this recommendation. I now provide an overview of my key recommendations and points of contention that remain. That's good. Here's the larger versions of these maps from my original Section 42A report. The major change I have recommended in response to submissions from Rangatahi Limited and Koning Family Trust and Martin Koning is to rezone 2 large blocks of land in Raglan West to future urban zone. This is because future residential growth should be planned for, and the locations are generally appropriate for such growth. In my view, a live residential zone is inappropriate for this land until matters around the lack of infrastructure servicing or funding and certain environmental effects are resolved. This is the Rangatahi South area, and this is Koning.
Yep, thank you.
I have also recommended a change to the wording of policy 4.1.18 Raglan to recognise that Rangatahi Peninsula should not be the only location to accommodate medium to long-term growth in Raglan. That's a change. If you'd like to see that on the screen. There. In response to Kainga Ora's submission seeking medium density residential zone be applied to a number of towns, I have accepted the merits of a medium density zone for Raglan in principle, but recommended that the physical extent of this zone be amended. This is to allow for town centre expansion as per Waikato 2017 and address the special character elements for the town. Here's the recommended rezoning in response to that submission. For this reduced area of medium density residential zone, I also recommend that the medium density residential zone plan provisions that apply to Raglan be modified so that proposals are assessed against the special character criteria and a 7.5 metre height limit applies. These recommended changes are included in Mr. Cleese's Thematic Issues 16th April 42A report. However, I wish to point out that Mr. Cleese's track change provisions only apply the special character assessment to developments involving 4 or more dwellings, whereas my intention was for them to apply to any multi-unit development. In response to McCracken's surveyors, I have recommended a relatively modest extension of business zone land in the Lorenzen Bay area. This better matches the road end layout for the subdivision application currently being processed by council, where a second access to the development area from the state highway has been removed. The recommended rezoning is shown here. I understand that this rezoning is agreed, as I have accepted the submission in full and no rebuttal evidence was received. 6 smaller scale site-specific submissions were received, generally seeking rezoning from rural to a country living or residential zone. I have not recommended any zoning changes in response to these. The coastal strip along the Rangatahi Peninsula is split zoned, and in my rebuttal evidence, I recommended it be zoned fully Rangatahi Peninsula. I now wish to rescind this recommendation, as I have been made aware that this issue has been addressed previously as part of the Rangatahi hearing, when it was agreed that it should be zoned rural. For those submitters who have prepared evidence on this topic, the remaining matters of contention are set out below. There are also other submissions I have recommended rejecting who have not provided any evidence and are not scheduled to appear at the hearing. Koning seeks a residential zone for its land rather than the future urban zone I have recommended. Specifically, there is disagreement with my analysis that a residential zone is inconsistent overall with the Waikato Regional Policy Statement development principles. In my view, that planning and funding of infrastructure to service the area should be better secured before the land can be rezoned residential. Should the panel consider these issues resolved, I also disagree with the structure and some of the detail of the planning provisions that the submitter has proposed for the land. The future urban zone for the Rangatahi land is agreed. In addition, Rangatahi's planning expert seeks that a requirement for a council-led spatial plan for Raglan is added to policy 4.1.18. I addressed this matter in my section 42A report, where I do not recommend any changes to policy 4.1.18. Kainga disagrees on the 7.5 metre height limit for the medium density residential zone that I have recommended. The experts state that the lower height limit will overly restrict certain typologies of medium density housing. In relation to the physical extent of the zone, they are unclear that the reduced extent of medium density zone to allow for town centre expansion is necessary. Late rebuttal evidence has been received from Elizabeth Hughes and Bernard Brown, which has been accepted by the panel. This disagrees with my recommendations not to rezone the submitters' respective properties from rural to residential. In relation to Ms. Hughes' evidence, I was previously unaware that the significant natural area on the property at 7 Calvert Road is recommended to be removed by reporting for hearing 21A. However, this does not change my overall recommendation to reject the submission. My amended reasons are the same as for other properties in my original report. If zoned residential, the property would be subdividable, and there is no policy direction supporting residential expansion this far from the Raglan Township. It also appears that there is no capacity in the wastewater network to accept further discharges from this area. As a side note, I have reviewed the proposed rural zone rules as they apply to the property, and I believe that a granite plat could potentially be built as a permitted activity on the site as the submitter wishes. Bernard Brown's rebuttal evidence does not contain any information that causes me to change my recommendation in my section 42A report. His evidence states that the character of existing and future surrounding land uses is residential due to the Whango Coast development area, I accept that there may be existing residential activities on surrounding sites. However, the residential zone is a zone of suburban and urban character. I have looked further into the Whango Coast development area, which applies to land adjoining the submitter's property. In combination with the restrictions of the significant natural area overlay that also applies to this land, I would not expect residential development of a suburban nature to be able to occur on those sites. I expect the future character of the area to continue to be more rural in nature. There is also disagreement on the scale of forecast residential supply and demand at Raglan over the short, medium, and long term. Dr. Davies' supplementary evidence paints a different picture of the situation at Raglan than his previous framework report. The supplementary evidence suggests supply of dwellings will easily meet NPSUD demand over the 15-year timeframe to 2036, whereas the framework report indicated a likely deficit over all three timeframes. As an illustration of the differences for the medium-term timeframe, I have created table 1 based on my understanding of the evidence. So that's showing in the supplementary evidence a large surplus, Dr. Davies' supplementary figures. Dr. Fairgrave for Rangatahi is also predicting a surplus, while Mr. Colgrave for Koning is predicting a deficit, and that's over the medium-term timeframe. And the figures are quite different there. I have been advised by Dr. Davey that the figures in the supplementary evidence are generally more accurate, as the yields in the framework report were not calibrated for market realisable. However, the supplementary evidence used computer modelling to predict supply, and Dr. Davey and I identified that it has generated about 1,000 extra lots for Rangatahi Peninsula over the expected yield of 500 to 550 dwellings. The extra 1,000 should be removed. This means supply of dwellings by 2036 is likely to range between approximately 600 to 1,100.
Ms. Buckingham, just on that point, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but if we take your paragraph 30 and apply it to your chart, does that mean that the 2,103 additional there in the second column, should that be 1,103?
Yeah, roughly, yes,
yeah.
Mr. Cooney.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Davey has also advised that the demand calculation in the supplementary evidence is considered more accurate than the framework report. He also accepts Dr. Fairgrave's rebuttal evidence that allowance for holiday dwellings could increase this demand figure. Therefore, the range for dwelling demand by 2036 is likely to range between approximately 800 to 1,400. The situation for the short term, 2023, is similar, where Dr. Fairgrave predicts a surplus and Mr. Colgrave predicts a deficit of 86, I believe. And Dr. Davies' supplementary evidence didn't include short-term demand, so I haven't got a figure for that. Overall, there is not agreement on whether there will be a surplus or deficit of residential dwellings at Raglan over the short and medium term. There could be a surplus of around 400 dwellings or a deficit of around 800 dwellings. Infill and medium density zone capacity within the existing residential area is estimated at around 200 to 500, so would not be able to meet the deficit of 800. In these circumstances, my view is that planning for new residential growth areas is prudent and advisable where this meets the relevant statutory tests, especially since Raglan is a holiday town with additional seasonal population, which creates some uncertainty in using the usual forecasting methods. I consider that the need for new residential land should not override all other considerations, and medium to long-term supply does not necessarily need to be brought forwards. My recommendations would result in additional short-term in the medium density zone and medium-term in the future urban zone development capacity while coordinating infrastructure requirements. This concludes my opening summary of the Raglan rezoning topic. I look forward to hearing evidence presented by submitters and welcome any questions that the panel may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Buckingham. I suspect there will be some questions, but let's see how we go. Mr. Marg.
Nothing from me, thank you.
Ms. Sedgwick?
Yes, I do. Oh, can you I don't need that up on the screen for myself. Ms. Buckingham, just in relation to point 16 in your evidence, where you talk about Kaingora and the medium density residential zone, can you talk me through your thinking which led you to those specific marked spots? Was there a pattern to that or a reason for that? I'd be interested to know why.
Okay, sure.
As shown on that map there, yes.
Yeah, I'll just bring up the Kaingora map as well. Okay, so this is the location sought by Kaingora, which is larger. And what I have recommended here is to move it back off the coast, the blocks that are next to the coast. And that was advised by his name, special character landscape architect who was involved in that hearing.
Right. Is there something significant then in that area between well, it looks like Long Street and James Street potentially?
Yeah.
Where you've I'm trying to point, but it's not working. Where there's one lighter shade of yellow in the middle of all those.
So that is a block that's identified in Waikato 2070 for town centre expansion.
Ah, okay, lovely, thank you.
As well as the one next to it at Gilmore Street.
Yeah, thank you. I have no more questions.
Thank you. Ms. Tiaho?
I don't have any questions, but I just really want to thank you. I found your comparisons and your diagrams really helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Gibb?
Yes, thank you. And I just also do want to compliment you for your report because I found it really easy to follow. I have a couple of points I want clarity around. My concern about these predicted shortfalls or surpluses of available land is the different types of land. So you've got your Kaingora and you've got your rangatahi. Now they're two totally opposite types of properties. And then you've got your affordable housing need in between. And it appears to me the shortfall may be in the affordable housing area. So I'm a bit confused about all of these numbers because it would have been great to see, and maybe I've missed it, a surplus in possible high quality areas versus a shortfall in the affordable. I don't know, and I don't know the answer to that, but that's possibly where I'm a bit concerned about whether we have enough or not. And there was a comment, and I cannot recall which report I read it in, that the projected growth rate of 1% seems a bit low to me because someone actually said there would have been a higher base rate if there were availability now. I think, obviously I don't recall who said that. Someone might be able to refresh me. So before I go on to my next point, have you got any comments about that, please?
Yes, I think in the economic evidence for coning, there is comment that because the supply is so restricted, that has also restricted the population growth rate.
To date.
To date, yeah. And if there had been more supply, then it might have been higher. So that might have been where you read that. And regarding your comments on the supply affordable versus higher range, I haven't gone into that level of analysis, although I expect that the medium density residential zone, it does allow smaller dwellings, whereas on the greenfields, you might be more likely to get the more expensive development on that land. So
possibly, yeah.
There's a bit of both, and in the township infill, there would be potential for some of those smaller, more affordable infill house developments.
Yes, and so live zone versus the fuzz is, so live zone, I think I'm correct that Lorenzen Bay and Flax Cove are live zone along with some of Rangatahi at the moment. So I'm just not sure about the types of housing that are in Lorenzen Bay and Flax Cove, or the ones that are perhaps the prices of the sections. My second point was about the water supply. And even if the consents are granted, that there was a comment that in 2034, the water take consent could even be less, even if it is granted. And my thinking around that was maybe we need to explore other options, which you have talked about. The likes of water tanks and roof collection. I mean, it happens in other countries where there's water shortages. I know that wouldn't perhaps solve the solid waste issues, but have you given thought to, I just don't suppose you've given thought to water tanks and how that would work?
No, I haven't. I acknowledge that there's a renewal in the medium term for that spring, but I haven't addressed it as part of, apart from just checking that water supply is feasible to the proposed development areas. I haven't
Yeah, there was a comment about
feasibility of renewing that consent.
Yes, I know. Apart from the consent, there was some comment about alternative arrangements. So I just later on, perhaps that will come up with other evidence. Thank you very much, Ms. Buckingham.
Thank you, Ms. Gibb. Mr. Fulton, please.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Ms. Buckingham. I just ask a question here of, in your key recommendations at 14, you're suggesting that there'd be 2 large areas of further urban zoning of Connang's and Rangatahi Peninsula. I just want to know, do you have a view on the fact that if land is zoned further urban zone, does that give that land a higher value or a higher status because it's got that zoning on it? It can be seen, if it is on it, as if to say, well, this is going to be where the next lot of town's going to develop. Most possibly is, but may not be, because other land may be offered which may be more suitable and might be somewhere else. I'm just wondering about the value that, or the status that this might put on the district plan if that land has that value added to it.
The future urban zone gives a clear direction that that's where future residential is anticipated, and allows for forward planning for service in that area. But are you talking about economic value of the land?
Yes.
Yes, I imagine that it would have some effect, depending on what the person who owns it would like to do with it. But yeah, it gives some surety to an owner that in some way their land will be suitable for residential development in future.
Yeah, so
it's just a detail to be sorted out.
Yeah, if it's sold, it could probably be sold with a tag, effectively saying that's more value because it's zoned. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Cooney.
It's just following on from Mr. Fulton's questions. There's a very strong case or submission put out by Rangatahi to say, look, we want our land future urban, we want the Conan land future urban, but there should be a spatial plan. Doesn't the fact that that you're saying, well, yeah, it should be future urban, and if we look at that submission from Rangatahi, isn't there an argument there? Well, if you're so strong about a spatial plan, why would you want to zone all this land future urban, which would foreclose on your options under your spatial plan? It comes back to bite them a little bit, doesn't it?
How would that foreclose the options? Sorry, Mr. Mr.
Well,
Crane?
a spatial plan, the submissions that I've read say, look, you shouldn't be allowing any further live zoning here until we do a spatial plan to know where everything goes and what will be built and things like that. So I'm saying, well, if you take that argument to its conclusion, you may as well, you could say, well, why even zone this land future urban? Because as Mr. Fulton says, there may be other land around that comes on the market that's a better place.
Well, the future urban zone is it's a form of recognition that this is an appropriate place, the logical place for the next expansion area. So, and then
Okay.
they can
Well,
deal with it.
I'll be asking the same questions of some of the others. But another point is we've got your chart there, and thanks for that. That's very helpful. Does that demand include? Does it include the medium density availability?
The supplementary evidence by Dr. Davies should include the medium density. Yes.
It's included in there, you think? Okay. Yeah, I would have expected that too. Just on that point, it's not a you don't, in assessing numbers, what's your view on getting the numbers dead right, or can you take a more general view? What's your view on that?
I did want to take a general view, but because I've got such differing outcomes, I felt a need to sort of understand a bit deeper into what the actual numbers were, because that if there's is a surplus, then that sort of informs whether or not there's a need to rezone the extra land or not. So I've got, I would be not so concerned about the numbers if they were generally pointed in the same direction, but they're not. So.
Okay. Have you seen, and this is probably a question mainly aimed at the lawyers and probably the economists, but does the NPS UD, does it require each town to have capacity to deal with demand, or is it wider than that and it's across the district that you look at it in the end? So what's your view? For example, there might be a deficit in terms of capacity at Raglan, but it could be made up, for example, in Pocono. Not that we'd want to have all the capacity in one area, but just theoretically, that's what you could look at. What's your view on that?
My understanding is that it is a district-wide requirement to provide the capacity. And however, because this is one of the 6 towns that 80% of the growth is planned for to go into, it's sensible for it to take its share.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thanks for your report.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Buckingham. Just a couple from me, and they're following on from questions from commissioners earlier. And following on from what Mr. Cooney said, and it's timely that your chart is still on the screen. I mean, depending on who you talk to, you get a completely different answer, is a very crude way of expressing that. And I take that to mean that all of these numbers, whoever does them, are simply projections. So none of them are correct. It's just a matter of dealing with uncertainty going forward. So given that, should we err on the side of undersupply or oversupply?
To choose one, err on the side of probably undersupply.
Why would we do that?
Because the surpluses are medium term are probably around 400 at best. There may be areas, so at the moment we have live zoned areas that aren't going ahead. They've been delayed, can't make people develop.
But doesn't that give people options? You know, if all your eggs are in the basket of a particular area and a particular owner, and for whatever reason that owner says, well, no, my area is zoned, it's the only area that's zoned, but it doesn't suit what I want to do. Doesn't that mean that you're actually putting a bit of a set of handcuffs on land supply?
I was saying to err on the undersupply, which means that I would say that a deficit or about even. So
sorry, no, maybe I can just clarify my question. Should we be making more, in the event of uncertainty, should we be having more live zoning or less live zoning?
If you're just looking at supply and demand, more live zoning.
Yes.
But I have stated that I think it needs to pass the other statutory requirements as well.
No, and I understand that, but those other statutory requirements aren't set in stone either. There's guidance, there's direction, there's exemptions in future-proof, all those sorts of things, you know, where it makes sense, and they've got to be properly justified. But one of the big criticisms of house prices at the moment, we've had a lot of evidence, particularly in this area, from people saying there's a massive deficit in affordable housing. And I know the Kāinga Ora submission may well address that to some degree. And I want to ask you a question about that in a minute. But it still begs the question, doesn't it, that if you artificially constrain land supply, inevitably the price of land rises, the price of sections rise, the price of housing rises. And in the interests of strict adherence to boundaries, you end up in a situation that might meet the letter of the policy documents, but it's a very poor outcome because those alternatives haven't been considered, and there's been this sort of slavish reliance on boundaries shown in, for example, future-proof. So I guess my question is, what's the risk? What's the downside in being overly generous in terms of land supply where it's justified and where it meets the statutory tests?
The downside potentially is spreading your resources a bit too widely on trying to fund all these different areas for their infrastructure.
Well, I'm glad you gave that answer, because that was segued nicely into my next question. It seems to me that there's an inevitable problem facing local government everywhere in New Zealand, and not just in this district, of the need for upgraded and enhanced infrastructure and the ability to pay for it. You know, we're seeing, certainly in our neck of the woods, you know, high rates rises. There's rates rises in parts of the country that are in double digits, you know, all those sorts of things. So what's the problem, if you like, in live zoning, subject to ensuring that the appropriate infrastructure is in place? And if that means that the council isn't prepared to fund it, but a private developer is, for example, and they say, look, this live zoning of my land makes sense. I know it needs to be serviced. I'll pay for it. What's the harm in that?
Yeah, it is a tricky one. If they are happy to pay for the infrastructure, then that does remove the problem. In this case, I don't have any evidence of that infrastructure being funded in the short or medium term for this land. And that causes me to think this is not giving effect to the RPS policy 6.3. However, if there was forward planning for this to be funded and provided for the infrastructure, then it's just live zoning. I think as long as it was within the near term would be appropriate.
Okay, all right, no, that's helpful, thank you. This is possibly a difficult question to ask or get you to answer, largely because of the way these hearings are constructed. That a big part of the future supply in Raglan, as per your reporting, is based on the upzoning of the medium density zone in the existing residential area. And we're not hearing Kaingaora's evidence on that until a separate hearing later on. But what we have heard a lot of evidence on at previous hearings in relation to Raglan, and it's really Ms. Gibbs' point, and that is there's a bit of there's clearly some tension between preserving the character of Raglan, which is, I think it's pretty well acknowledged is different from all the other 5 towns that you've mentioned, and intensifying in and around that, not central town area, but you know what I mean, the areas that are sort of in that existing area that does have character. Is there a risk that some of the capacity in the town area, if that's not realised, that the whole future of Raglan sort of goes upside down, because the only area of any substance left to develop is Rangatahi, and that's, as Ms. Gibbs said, that's not really affordable housing. That's, you know, that's a conventional and dare I say, you know, high quality, almost lifestyle type development. How do we balance that all up in your mind? Because there's quite a lot of moving parts, and the overall solution depends on all the parts coming together. And it seems to me, at least, there's some reasonable uncertainty on the realizability of some of them, particularly that mixed housing in the town centre area. Well, not the town centre, but the area around the town. Sorry, it's a very long-winded way of expressing that. But do you?
Yes, it is a balance. So I have taken advice from what's happened for the special character hearing in the Raglan hearing previously. And I suppose when I considered the Kaingaora submission, I was keen to balance out what had already been discussed with what they were seeking. And with the reduced height, but allowing a bit of some areas to become medium density residential zone, I felt that some of the outcomes sought in that hearing of being able to put a smaller house on the existing section within the existing special character could be achieved. And you're right, I don't see the newer growth areas having that same character. And the special character provisions exclude Rangatahi Peninsula because it's all new. So what I've done, I would hope that this identified character wouldn't be lost in that existing township area. And the other areas are already rural, so they don't have quite the same starting point.
All right, okay, no, that's helpful, thank you. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I thought you'd finished. If you were something else, oh. Could I just echo the comments that have been made before? Your summary was really, really helpful, and it's almost like an exemplar for those that have gone before and those that we'll see in the future. It was to the point. I articulated a summary, articulated what the problems were, highlighted your recommendations in a very, very helpful way. So we're very grateful for that. And it's, as I say, it's a bit of an exemplar. So you might want to send a copy of that to your colleagues who are yet to appear, and they might take that on board.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the Regional Council, Ms. Foley. Morning, Ms. Foley. Just a quick question for you. I see that your statements relate to the rezonings more generally than just Raglan.
Yes, they do.
How do you want to address us today on the full suite, or are you happy to come back hearing by hearing?
No, I was going to address the whole lot today. That I discussed that with the hearing administrator, and he was
I think you may have done too, and that's absolutely fine. And that's absolutely fine. Thank you.
Okay, so atmarie, I rawa hikite I tātou I tēnei rā. So thank you for letting me present to you today. I am in our new building for the first time, and there's still a bit of construction going on, so there may be the occasional bang, and I apologise for that.
That's quite all right. Thank you.
Okay, so in my evidence for this hearing, I set out Waikato Regional Council's overall position, including support for the use of the future urban and residential medium density zones, and support for no further expansion of the country living or village zones. I also provided my position on the specific rezoning requests. For the most part, I support the recommendations of the individual Section 42A reports. There are a small number of recommendations that I do not or only partially agree with, as set out in my rebuttal evidence, and that's what I will now discuss.
Okay.
The first is Te Kōwhai Airfield. In Waikato Regional Council's original submission, we raised concerns about the proposed rezoning of Te Kōwhai Airfield on the basis that the proposal represents a departure from the future-proof settlement pattern and that further assessment was required. I acknowledge that this proposal is one that is unique to New Zealand, and as such, the demand is difficult to gauge. For this reason, in my primary evidence, I opposed the rural residential zoning only and requested that this component be removed or reduced until it can be demonstrated that there is a demand for air park living on large lots at this location. I acknowledge that it could also be potentially managed through provisions for the airfield, as noted in the rebuttal Section 42A report. The Regional Council did not participate in Hearing 17 as our concerns related to the application and extent of the zone, not the potential provisions. So I respectfully ask that the panel consider our position outlined in my primary evidence and expanded on in my rebuttal evidence when making a decision in relation to Kōwhai Airfield. Further, Mr. Cleese, the Section 42A report author, recommends that two parcels of land that adjoin the airfield at 158 and 176 Lima Road be rezoned for rural residential. I disagree with this recommendation. The Framework Section 42A report sets a clear position on rural residential rezonings. The rural residential zoning is only being considered on the land associated with the airfield because it is part of the air park and is a specific style of development that is tied to the airfield. Adding these two other parcels that are straight rural residential with no additional requirements or ties to the airfield is contrary to that position. Okay, I'll now move to the CSL proposal at Pokeno. In my primary evidence, I opposed the CSL rezoning request. The Section 42A report author, Mr. Mead, has rejected the country living zone, which I support, but has recommended approving the rezoning of the residential zone component. I'm opposed to the residential zone part of the recommendation. Mr. Mead has supported the rezoning of the residential component on the basis that it adjoins the Munro block and will allow for integrated infrastructure planning. The submitter's evidence in the Section 42A report acknowledged that there are wastewater capacity and water supply issues that need to be resolved for the live zoned Munro block and therefore for this land. Given that this land has not been identified in Waikato 2070, should the panel support this rezoning, my preference would be for a future urban zone, which would signal that the land has been considered for urban development and still allow for integrated infrastructure development. It would also manage expectations as to when the land would be able to be serviced and released and would allow for a structure plan process to be undertaken. For the Pokeno Havelock Village proposal, in my primary evidence, I supported in part the submission relating to Havelock Village. I supported the residential component, but expressed concerns with the proposed rural residential development. Mr. Mead, the Section 42A report author, supports the rural residential as he considers it will help restrict the likelihood of urban development spilling over Transmission Hill to the south-facing slopes. I disagree that an artificial boundary is needed in this location. The ridgeline with its significant vegetation is a natural boundary that provides a clear edge to the urban area. I'm still of the opinion that the rural residential should not be supported. However, I requested that a number of amendments be made should the rural residential rezoning proceed. Mr. Mead, in his rebuttal evidence, continues to recommend approval of the rural residential zone in this location, but has amended his recommendation to include several of my requested amendments, which I support. In regard to the Kirrimua Trust proposal at Tuako, the Section 42A report author, Ms. Trenuth, has recommended that an area west of Geraghty's Road be given a future urban zone. I do not support this recommendation on the basis that it does not give effect to the Waikato Regional Policy Statement, particularly Implementation Method 14.2.1. As the land contains high-class soils and has not been identified in Chapter 6 of the Regional Policy Statement or a council-approved growth strategy, rezoning this land to the future urban zone is inconsistent with the RPS. In relation to the interpretation of the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, the NPSUD, I am concerned with the focus and much of the evidence supporting rezoning requests being on capacity, the capacity aspect of the NPSUD, without any discussion or acknowledgement of the need for that capacity to contribute to well-functioning urban environments. Policy 1 of the NPSUD requires that planning decisions contribute to well-functioning urban environments, which is defined in the NPSUD. Lastly, I'd like to note that new population projections have been completed for the future-proof sub-region and they should be available in the coming months. These projections have been used to inform the Housing and Business Capacity Assessment, HBA, which is currently being finalised. Should these documents be made final and publicly available in the next month or so, they will be useful to the panel in your decision-making on zone extents. The HBA will inform the housing bottom lines, which are the minimum capacity requirements for housing and business capacity, which will be directly inserted into the regional policy statement and district plans as soon as practicable after the HBA is publicly released as required by the NPSUD. Thank you for your time. Kia ora.
Thank you, Ms. Foley, and thank you for reminding us about the breadth of the NPS urban development. Let's just see if there's any questions. Ms. Sedgwick?
No, I have no questions. Thank you. That was very clear.
Ms. Tiaho?
I just wonder, Ms. Foley, if you heard the questions that the chair put to the reporting officer around infrastructure in terms of the live residential zone as opposed to the recommendations of the reporting officer, and the question around whether if the developers were prepared to pay for and develop the infrastructure, that might make a difference to her opinion. And I'm just wondering, does that, what are your thoughts on that line of questioning?
I think if the developer is willing to pay some money, that does go some way towards it, but it depends on the location of the development. For example, if it's a landowner that has land that is further away from the existing urban area, and you're having to put infrastructure in to reach that site, are they going to be willing to pay for the section of infrastructure that is not direct, like that needs to go in between their site and the existing urban area? You know, that becomes complicated. There's more infrastructure that has to be thought about than just the water and wastewater in terms of public transport. In some locations, we've got developers who have developed ahead of sequence and then expected the site to be serviced by public transport, which puts pressure on the regional council to provide that public transport. However, if you're having to pass through an area that is not yet developed to get to a developed area, it puts pressure on scheduling and the routes and the funding. So it is a bit more complicated than just the developer paying to put in the water and wastewater to service the site. So there's a lot of doing a future urban zone allows for a lot of those things to be worked through before the land is actually live zoned.
Just in terms of the Raglan kaupapa that we're looking at specifically today, one of the questions that came up earlier was around if you were to err on the side of providing a surplus or a deficit, what would your preference be? I just wonder what your thoughts are, given that one of the attractions of Raglan is the kind of environmental you know, the sea, the water, etc. And if there was a surplus, would that actually affect the quality of, particularly of the sea, because they're still discharging out into the ocean? Do you have any comments about that, about the reporting officer's response and that table in her opening statement?
Yeah, Raglan is a tricky one, and it is obviously a unique area, and it's got a beautiful setting, and that attracts a lot of people there. So obviously development in that area does need to be carefully considered to not to detract from that. I guess if you have a surplus and have more zoned land, it does help keep the, you know, stop people from necessarily land banking and pushing prices up. But then it takes away that certainty about where infrastructure is going in and the staging around that land. So there are pros and cons to each approach, to having more live zoned and having less live zoned, and they have to be weighed up in the circumstances. So if you've got a landowner who is keen and ready to go and you know, is willing to put that infrastructure in, then yes, live zone the land and make it available. But the council also needs to be able to have that funding available in their long-term plan to pay their share for things like putting in bus shelters and community centres and play equipment and all that type of thing. So it all just needs to be balanced out. So sorry, I can't give you a yes or a no.
No, that's I just wanted to see what your thoughts were. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ms. Tiaho. Ms. Gibb?
No, nothing from me, thank you.
Mr. Fulton?
No, I have no further questions. Thank you.
Mr. Marg?
No, nothing from me. Thank you.
Mr. Cooney?
It's just questions. Just on that point about the developer paying for infrastructure, we've got a good example here, haven't we, with Rangatahi, where they're some distance away from the town, and they built a big bridge. So isn't that a good example of what a developer can do by way of infrastructure?
Yeah, absolutely. That if you've got a developer that has the resources and is able to put in that infrastructure ahead of the development, then that is that's great. Not all developers are in that position that they are ready to go and able to finance that infrastructure up front.
No. You mentioned some further information coming out shortly. What was that? That was in relation to the HBA assessment, wasn't it?
Yes, yep. So the housing and business capacity assessment that's required by the NPSUD is currently being finalised. So it's been based on new population projections that have been done by NIDIA at the University of Waikato. They have been delayed somewhat because of the issues with the census, but so they have. So that housing and business capacity assessment, we have a draft now which needs to go through each of the partner councils and get signed off, and then it'll be publicly released, and then that'll be the basis of the direct insertion of those housing bottom lines into the regional policy statement.
Can I ask you, has demand increased or has it reduced?
The populations do show that demand has changed, and as you can appreciate with COVID, there's a lot of uncertainty. So I can't really give you too much detail at the moment, but when those the housing and business capacity assessment is available, then you'll be able to see the detail.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how we can handle that, because it's new information and every submitter is entitled to see that as well and comment on it. So it's a matter, we'll have to look at that from a procedural point of view, but thanks very much.
Just one question for me, I think, Ms. Foley, and it's really the role of the future urban zone, and others of the commissioners earlier have asked questions of Ms. Buckingham around, you know, what does the zoning of something that's future urban mean in the bigger sense, and it seems to me, at least on its face, if you go back and do a future-proof strategy or a Waikato 2070, you're looking at the district as a whole, and you're looking at things in a very integrated way. Most of the fuzz proposals that we have are, and I don't mean this pejoratively, are somewhat opportunistic, you might say. And I don't mean that in any sense other than saying they've arisen because a particular landowner has done a bunch of work that says my area looks like it's appropriate for urban development, but not yet. So please zone it future urban. And that does, it seems to me, give it some sort of status going forward. But absent that wider district or regional growth strategy, it might be in entirely the wrong place when you look at it in that more integrated way. So what do you see the value of the fuzz zone being in that context?
Well, in my evidence, I've generally supported the future urban zone in areas where it's been consistent with Future Proof and Waikato 2070. So it's already been indicated that it's been looked at by the council. For example, at Pocono, there's the area on the eastern side of the expressway. And it's been identified for future, it's been recommended for future urban growth. And that's an acknowledgement that that's an area that is probably sensible to further develop, but there are issues around infrastructure that aren't going to be sorted out in the short term. So it's basically holding it there, making sure it's similar to that urban expansion zone, that overlay for the Hamilton City, that basically gives it a level of protection from further development so that it doesn't get cut up, it isn't harder to develop in the future, and gives the landowner some certainty that it is going to be looked at for residential in the future. And then the council can also start working on what needs to be done to enable that land to be released. So, how for Pocono, how we're going to get people from that side of the highway into Pocono safely.
Right. Okay.
Plus getting its services across there as well. So, yeah. Very
good. No, that's helpful. Thank you very much, and thank you for your evidence and your summary today. That's been very helpful. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Which brings us to Ms. Julian for Elmer's Development Limited, please.
Good morning, everyone. Yes, I'm Hannah Julian from Shield Consultants, and I will be speaking to Mr. Barrett's submission that he has lodged on behalf of Elmer's Development. So the purpose of Mr. Barrett's submission is to extend the business zone within the Lorenzen Bay plan by 0.5 hectares. If you have the Council's 42A report in front of you, you'll be able to see that in figure 11, there was originally going to be 2 entrances to this development, one slightly further down to the south and one slightly more to the north. When the resource consent was lodged with Council, through the processing process, Council had requested that the more southern entrance be closed off and the roundabout removed. So that was done as a part of the design, and then that underlying area that was the road and the roundabout was then changed to residential zone. So this is about 0.5 hectares, and it's not really in an ideal position. And this is because it's in a bit of an illogical position in the subdivision itself, because it's wedged between 2 business zones. It's actually, the area itself is also going to be difficult to achieve the ideal residential alignment shapes and performance standards easily, particularly where the road was going to be. And the calculations have been done, and they think that we can get maybe 6 allotments in here in the area identified in red. So because of this, Mr. Barrett has proposed to change this residential zone to business. This would be more ideal because it would decrease any potential inter-zone boundary issues like reverse sensitivity. It would increase the availability of vacant business zone in Raglan, where a shortfall has been identified in the Section 42A report. It is only a relatively small change. We're only talking about 0.57 hectares, which would combine with the existing 1.9 hectares identified. The other thing, being able to connect the 2 business zones together increases the business connectivity and efficiencies for traffic, access, all of those things. It would also be better suited for business as it does front the state highway. And as identified in both the submission and the Section 42A report, there are some positive economic benefits which could result from this. I have read through Council's Section 42A report, and I agree with the conclusion to accept the change. And this is because, in summary from the report, Council's reasonings align with the submission, The shape of the residential zone doesn't particularly align with ideal outcomes for the residential standards. It would be more efficient as a business zone and has the capacity to increase economic capability. And in Council's point 176, they recommend to accept this change. Overall, it is a small scale change of 0.5 hectares, but it does have the capacity to increase efficiency and economic capacity while avoiding inappropriate residential development within Raglan. Therefore, we agree with Council's recommendation to amend the zoning to the more appropriate business zone.
Thank you, Ms. Julian. I suspect we won't have any questions because there's not much to ask about, given that there seems to be no dispute about it, but let me just check that that's the case. Ms. Sedgwick?
No, I have no questions. Thank you.
Ms. Gibb?
Nothing from me, thank you.
Mr. Marg?
All right.
Mr. Fulton?
No, I have nothing. Thank you.
Ms. Tiaho?
No, thank you.
Mr. Cooney?
No, thank you.
No, and I don't have any either. Thank you very much, Ms. Julian.
Not a problem, thank you.
Thank you. Now, we were due to hear from Mr. Beamsley at the moment, but apparently he can't be with us at the moment. Ms. Parkinson, is Ms. Parkinson still with us? I think she may have gone. Oh no, gosh.
Oh dear.
Just a quick question for you, Ms. Parkinson. Would you have any objection to Mr. Beamsley presenting immediately in front of you after morning tea?
No, sir. But Dr. McGill is now present as well. I'm sorry, we'll zoom in once we're presenting, so you can.
No, that's absolutely fine. I just want to make, rather than have Mr. Beamsley wait till you folk have finished, because there's obviously quite a few of you. Hopefully it won't disrupt you too much if Mr. Beamsley takes a short period immediately after morning tea to present his evidence to us.
Not at all, sir. Please proceed with Mr. Beamsley.
Thank you very much, Dr. McGill. That's appreciated. Which means that Mr. Brown and Ms. Hughes, please. Don't forget to turn your sound on. You haven't. Very good. Just when you're ready. Thank you.
Kia ora, Mr. Chairman.
Good morning.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, fundamentally, I'm objecting to the inclusion in the new rural zone as outlined in items 229 and 230 of the section 42A report.
Can we put the copy of a map of Mr. Brown's property there, Mr. Chair?
Yes, we can.
Sorry, Mr. Brown, for interrupting.
It's probably easier if we get Mr. Bell to do that. I mean, I can do it, but it will take me a little bit longer, Mr.
1 second, I'm just with the submitters now. What was your address, sorry?
I think it's 759 Wainui Road, isn't it?
Correct. Can everyone see that?
There's nothing there yet.
Not quite.
Can everyone see
now
that?
We can.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, the property and subject property is actually highlighted in red.
Yes.
And it's located on the Whanga coast, approximately 100 metres from the actual Manu Bay surf zone.
Yes.
So the fundamental objection is that we are included in the new rural zone, and I emphasise new because we're currently in the operative plan in the coastal zone. So we request to be included in the residential zone, and my submission has 3 specific points that I'd like to draw to your attention. In the rural zone, no further development is actually possible because of this 25 metre separation distance from the boundary. And given that the property is only 30 metres wide and the area of the property is 2,000 square metres, we simply do not have room to establish a future granny flat, which I would like to be able to do as a permitted activity under the rural zone for the well-being of my family. That's the first point, Mr. Chairman. The second point is that the planner's report talks about reverse sensitivity effects in the rural zone. And now I'd like to highlight here that there's been no rural uses either in this property or the adjoining properties in the time that we've lived here over a period of 45 years. So what are the reverse sensitivity activities? There's no animals, adjacent human beings, the culprits in this instance. The third point I'd like to highlight is that the planner states that the site is isolated, and if we were included in the residential zone, it would be a spot zoning. I've stated there that the planner fails to consider that we are part of and included in the large adjoining development areas as shown on planning map 23.1, Manu Bay of proposed district plan. Now, the scale of that development, Mr. Chairman, needs to be highlighted again, because the areas constitute approximately 75 hectares. This is multiple owned Maori land. And the number of shareholders involved in that land, even in the adjoining property that we live next to, approximately 600. But if you take the whole area included, then we're looking at well in excess of 10,000 shareholders here. That would be a speculative assessment, but there are a large number of landowners involved. In conclusion, I'm disappointed that the district plan removes the existing coastal zone over the Whonga coast and replaces it with a rural zone with a number of overlays with complex and dubious assessment criteria. Consider that the planner's report repudiates my request. It tends to fob off all our concerns. The planner's report fails to acknowledge the significance of the development areas surrounding our property and the significance of the planned Papakainga and urban areas in the context of the greater Raglan growth strategy. The proposed rural zoning for Whonga Coast and the subject property appears arbitrary, misleading, ambiguous, and fundamentally flawed. And Mr. Chairman, I've listened to the discussion here for the last hour, and I'm intrigued by two issues specifically. And I would ask you and ask the planner to consider the question of really, are we part of Raglan in this area, the Whonga Coast? I would also like to ask the planner, what is her definition of rural and rural activities? That's all, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brown. Ms. Hughes, we've got your written statement. Is there anything you want to add? And you're very welcome to. I'm not meaning to cut you short.
I'll just put a copy of Mr.
Yes,
Cole. See.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for listening to me in advance. As you can see, my property is highlighted in the red outline there.
Yes.
Now, first of all, I have to, if you have read my report, you will see that it would appear that the decision made not to support my request to be rezoned residential from I am coastal at the moment, and instead being rezoned to rural. This is what is proposed. I would like to be rezoned residential. I'm completely surrounded to my left and in front and to the side of front by other residential zoned properties. Basically, I'm in a residential enclave. the property behind me, well, basically, my block of land, as Mr. Brown stated, I don't know what is rural activity. There is no livestock, there is no farming. You've got people growing their veggies, but that's, you know, it's nothing big scale. What qualifies the rural nature for me to be rezoned? The second thing that I would like you to consider, although the planner has obviously addressed that, however, I'd like you to draw your attention in greater detail to it, was that my property was to be included under the, excuse me if you would, I'm a little bit nervous here.
Please don't be nervous, just imagine we're sitting in your living room talking to you, that's possible.
So
don't be nervous.
Okay, it was proposed that I was to be included in the significant natural area rezone thing. So somebody came out to visit my property. And in fact, you can see where it was proposed. So the green at the back there was to be included in the significant natural area. And the space in the part in front was where my dwelling in was not. So I was asked if I would like to have an environmentalist to come out and have a look at it to see if this was actually correct, because basically they don't know what my land is like and what's on it. You're making a guess about it. So they came out and he decided that most definitely was not to be included in that area, so therefore it has been lifted. However, the map that was provided to illustrate my property had not been updated. Therefore, a lot of the conclusions that the planner came to were based on that, which she mentioned that she accepts that she wasn't aware of it. That was the other thing I wanted to note. That map is still the map that is being shown, and it is not correct. As I said, I'm surrounded completely by other residential properties. My property is a very strange shape. It's about 30 meters wide. It's very long. Any boundaries that I would be inhibited by if I was to be rezoned residential would make it virtually impossible to put anything on my property. And as I said, all I would be wanting to do is to have some sort of small dwelling so Grandma can live her days in her property and perhaps have one of the family members close by to see if I'm okay. That's all we really want. There's no ideas of development or anything. The Whangaroa Environmental Defence Society objected to my request to be rezoned residential, citing that it would interfere with the what's it called? The
context.
No, so basically the significant natural area. What was it? Outstanding natural landscape. Thank you. Because they wanted to include me in the outstanding natural landscape. So that meant, as far as they were concerned, any future development there would interfere with the line from Karioy to the coast. My property is such that it is so set back, secluded, nothing is visible of it, basically, from any viewpoint. And there are no viewpoints from behind, only from the road. And there's nothing that can be seen. So basically, I would really like to know exactly why I should be rezoned rural. considering all these factors, apologise for my rather clumsy analysis of my situation, but
no, it's not clumsy at all. We've seen a lot of people present to us, including a bunch of professional people, and yours is as clear as the vast majority. So don't be apologetic for that. But let's see if there are any questions we have of you, because I think it's pretty clear. We'll mix and match. I mean, obviously you've got your two separate properties, but we'll ask I'll ask each commissioner to ask either of you or each of you any questions as they wish. Maybe start with you, Ms. Gibb, please.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Have either of you spoken at all to a duty planner at the council to see if it's possible for a resource consent for a minor dwelling in your current situations? Mr. Brown or Ms. Hughes, have you spoken to any duty planner at the council to see whether you could have a resource consent application for a minor dwelling on the property as it is? You both spoke about a granny flat. I'm calling, so I'll change that to a granny flat. Have you had any advice regarding whether you could build granny flats?
Yes, we have. And the existing house that exists on my property had to rely on existing use, the provisions of existing use to actually to be refurbished. Okay. Now, in the process of doing that, the house was located 1 metre from the boundary as an existing use. And initially, we were advised by council to seek resource consent from neighbouring owners. Now, the neighbouring property has 600 shareholders, and there was no one prepared to actually give a certain comment in terms of whether or not they would sign off on my existing house being rebuilt on the same footprint. So the same situation would evolve with a new granny flat. Any building would get the same degree of notice from the adjoining landowners, because no one will make a decision in terms of signing off. But the key point here really is the separation distance required, 25 metres in a 30-metre wide property.
And that's if it was rural.
That's actually, yeah, if it was rural, yes.
If it was, so under the coastal zone, what is the setback?
There's the same rules.
Okay.
There are the same rules, but as I've said in previous submissions, the coastal zone rules don't necessarily need to relate to the rural zone rules. So for the coastal zone, if it was still existing, why not change the rules? Because the landscape overall has no animals whatsoever in it, and there hasn't been animals here for 50 years. So a rural zone is just unbelievably flawed.
Okay, thank you. That's clarified some of your points. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I just wonder, before we move on, is someone from the council planning team that's on the call, without wanting to put them on the spot too much, give a view on what the minor dwelling or granny flat rules are in the rural zone as proposed, just so that we're clear?
I'm happy to do that, Dr. Mitchell.
Thank you.
As notified, a minor dwelling in a rural zone was a permitted or is a permitted activity, as long as it does not exceed 70 square metres gross floor area within a lot, and where there is an existing dwelling located on the lot, the minor dwelling must be located within 20 metres of the dwelling, and the minor dwelling must share a single driveway access with the existing dwelling. Those are the conditions that would apply to make it a permitted activity.
And given that we've had the rural hearing, is that was in the notified plan, Do you recall what the section 42A report author recommended in relation to that specific provision?
No, I'm not, but I can look it up for Mr. Brown.
I think that would be helpful. If you wouldn't mind just clarifying that for them. Obviously, there's no guarantee about any of that, and that's not particularly the submission point that they're making, but it may be helpful information for them.
Yep, no problem. I'll do that now.
Thank you. That would be helpful. Let's just see if there's any more questions, though. Ms. Sedgwick?
Nothing from me, thank you.
Mr. Marg?
Thank you both, but nothing from me. Thanks.
Mr. Fulton?
Excuse me, Ms. Hughes. Just on your property, there's two houses. Is there two houses? And which one do you live in? There's one near the front, and there's another one shown further back.
No,
it's not two houses?
No, absolutely not.
Okay. There's a
We
building
have
shown
one house, one dwelling.
Okay.
What's that building where the cursor is at the back there? What's that?
There isn't one.
It's a shed.
Okay.
It's a shed, basically, yeah.
Oh, there is a shed there. Okay.
Yes, but not in the middle. Oh, hang on. Yeah, it's the shed. Sorry, I haven't seen it from the actual photograph, and that was not there before. I mean, in the map, I haven't. Yeah.
It does exist though. There is a shed there, and that's in the significant,
yes.
Yeah, significant natural area in amongst the bush. Or yeah, okay.
It's actually not accurate, is it, Bernie? No. That is not accurate. I mean, there is a shed there, but it's not slap bang in the middle like that. Not in that location.
Okay, look.
It is more towards the boundary, and this. I actually have not seen a map with that included on it before.
Okay, fine. Look, I was just inquiring because I wasn't sure whether there was two.
Yeah, sure, no, fair enough.
The main point is the dwellings. The dwelling is definitely the building at the front.
Yes, absolutely. That is built by the Calvert, hence the Calvert Road all those years ago.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Mr. Fulton.
Mr. Bell, can you please just make me a co-host for a second? I just want to share the screen and show the recommendations for the rural zone minor dwelling.
That would be helpful. Thank you.
My computer.
Just while you're doing that, Ms. Tiaho, do you have any questions?
No, thank you. Thank you both.
Mr. Cooney?
No, you may think about getting independent planning advice on what you can do on your property. Sometimes an independent planner won't agree with what the council planner says, so you might want to think about doing that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And I don't, well, let's just say thanks, Ms. Ratt. Let's just. So this is the section 42A report author's most recent recommendation at the conclusion of the rural zone hearing, correct?
Correct. Yep.
So how does that differ from what you said to us in terms of the notified plan?
Okay, so what has changed is that there's been an increase in the maximum size. So it's increased from 70 square meters to 120 square meters.
Yes.
And there's also the distance between the primary dwelling and the minor dwelling has increased from 20 meters to being within 100 meters. And everything else has pretty much stayed the same.
No.
Speak.
No, that's not feasible on our particular property, Mr. Chairman.
Just explain that to me, Mr. Brown.
The site has an area of 2,020 square meters. It's 30 meters wide.
Yes.
And in lengthwise, on memory, it's about 50 meters, 60 meters maximum in length. So the distance of 100 meters from the existing residential unit would not comply at all.
Don't quite follow that. It's got to be not greater than 100 meters, not more than.
Located within 100 meters of the existing residential unit.
So you can, as I read that says that you have to be within 100 meters. And if you are, then you're permitted.
Oh,
and I think
within.
Yeah, so I think it's the opposite of what you're thinking.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah, well, that's the first time that's been drawn to my attention. I was unaware of the outcome of that hearing.
Okay, I don't want to put either of you on the spot, but
I mean,
assuming that were to remain the case, and that you could build as a permitted activity 120 square metre, I'll call it a granny flat, as long as it was in 100 metres of your existing dwelling, and as long as it didn't create a new driveway, and presumably it complied with the other setbacks from neighbours and those other things. Would that,
well, what would those
is that heading in the right direction? Let me put it that way.
Well, it's most helpful, but we still come down to what is separation distance from the boundaries.
Yeah, okay, that's what I wanted to check. All right, no, that's very helpful, but I think that's given just a little bit of clarity to us too. So grateful, Ms. Rapp, for pointing that out.
Thank you. Yeah.
Let me just check. I don't have any questions, but I just want to check if have I gone round the full panel?
Yes.
I think I have.
Yep.
My notes say I have, but I thought I'd better check. All right, thank you both very much.
Can I
Sorry.
ask just one thing?
Sure.
The map for the significant natural area, has that now been updated?
Well, not. The process is that it won't have any official status, whatever it is, until we issue our decisions. We've heard recommendations on all sorts of things through the course of the last 18 months or so. The plans themselves will only be updated once we issue our final decisions. So there may be drafts that the council are preparing based on their recommendations, but ultimately it's up to us to make those decisions, and we haven't made them yet, and we're issuing a single district plan decision for the district as a whole, of which this topic will be a part.
Yes, thank you for that. But when I tried to get evidence to support my significant natural area uplifting of that title on my property, there was a map.
Yes.
With showing evidence of that being lifted. So, like I say, as a late
That's
person,
a recommendation from the staff to us.
Right.
So, and we obviously take that recommendation on board.
Right.
But until we've made our final decision, it's just a recommendation.
So it was kind of wording. You know, yeah, okay. I wondered about that, but I presumed that it had definitely been lifted, you know.
Well, no,
I know. I can see what you're saying now.
it was in the proposed plan. It's still in the proposed plan.
Yes, yeah.
It's been recommended by staff to be amended.
Yes.
That's a recommendation to us. We
Right.
haven't issued our decision on that recommendation as yet.
Okay. No way. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you both very much. That's next time you do this, you'll be old hands at it, because this is about the second or third time we've seen you, so you won't be nervous next time.
Thank you.
Thank you both very much. Which I think brings us to our morning break. We'll adjourn until 5 to 11, and we'll hear from Mr. Beamsley straight after morning tea, and then we'll progress to Rangatahi Limited. Please just turn your videos and sound off if you're intending to remain on the call. Don't actually log off, please. So we'll adjourn for 15 minutes. All right, thank you, everybody. We'll resume. Mr. Beamsley, we're ready to hear from you now. Thank you, and thanks to Rangatahi for slotting you in ahead of them.
Yeah, thanks for that, and thanks for being flexible. Sorry, I was stuck in another meeting. So I guess I listened in briefly to the last submitter, and it's really very similar to their issue. It's around section sizes and zoning. So my section and my property is on Upper Wainui Road. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the zoning on Upper Wainui Road, particularly on the coastal side. 3/4 of the way up, it changes from being urban, and then it changes to coastal. You've probably got maps in front of you. Great, I can see you nodding away.
Yeah, no, we know where you are.
Great. Okay, so I guess my frustration is a little bit twofold. Originally, when the sewage system went in, you know, I got a letter from council advising me that because of the size of my section, I wasn't eligible to be in that service offering. And I kind of argued with council saying, well, my section is actually smaller than some of the ones down the hill. That seems ridiculous. And at that point, they changed the decision and offered everyone on that particular side of Upper Wainui to be included in the sewage system. And I actually signed up to that. And which was fine. I mean, it solved the sewage issue that I had on my property because it's a small property. And the second one is now that there is an opportunity to actually rezone some of those sections to something that is more appropriate given their size. Councils, in my mind, still haven't actually gone out and done due diligence around the size of those sections. So zoning my section for the dimensions of my particular section, they're 20 meters across by 40 meters long. Being zoned as a coastal dwelling or a coastal section, it means that I cannot build without a resource consent within 12 meters of any boundary. So that means basically I have to get a resource consent to build on that property. And there'll be a similar issue with all of those smaller properties up that side of the of Upper Wainui, which is crazy and which is kind of goes against that all of government push to make actual building of properties easier. The argument from council, you know, the argument from council or the rebuttal from council was around the fact that you know, these sections or these properties could be subdivided. My section is 400 square meters, so it cannot be subdivided. And also that the sewage system was at its limit. I'm already signed up to that sewage system. So none of those actually apply to my particular section. Maybe it applies to some of the sections further up. But I guess at a minimum, I'd be looking to get my property, my section zoned more appropriately, which would be urban. And even if there was a review of those further properties up further to kind of alleviate some of the restrictions that are placed on them because they are zoned coastal. That's all I have really.
All right, no, and that's very clear. Let's see if there's any questions for you, Mr. Fulton.
No, just looking at it though, you're wanting to really change the zoning. That's really what it's about, isn't it? And you've said from rural to
it's coastal to urban, yeah.
Coastal to urban, yeah, okay. Okay, I can see. All right. You did mention where did I see it? Oh no, that's right. No, I can see where you are now. Okay, no, thank you. No questions. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Marg?
No, thank you.
Ms. Gibb?
No, thank you.
Ms. Tauhall?
No, thanks, very clear.
Ms. Sedgwick?
No, indeed, very clear. Thank you.
Mr. Cooney?
Who's muted?
Mr. Cooney, you're on mute.
Yeah, thanks. Your section's what, 400, 450?
My section is 800 square meters, so it's too small to subdivide.
Okay. Okay, I thought you said somewhere along the line it was 450. 400.
No, I never said that. It's 800 square meters, so it's 20 meters across, 40 meters long.
Okay. What are the sizes of the other sections around there?
Looking at the district plan, they're similar. Some of the ones, the back sections are larger. I would say probably similar in terms of square meterage, the ones that are closest to the roadside.
Okay, yeah. Okay, no, thank you. That's interesting. I thought they were bigger than that, but yeah, no, thanks for that.
No, I think there's ones that are further up Wainui Road, but I can see there's maybe 5 or 10 sections that are actually impacted.
Okay. Okay, we'll have a look at that. So thanks.
No worries. Thank you very much.
And I don't have any questions either. Thank you, Mr. Beamsley. Thanks for your submission.
Awesome. And thank you very much for your time and the flexibility in allowing me to present.
A pleasure. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Which brings us to Rangatahi, please, Dr. McGill and Ms. Parkinson.
Thank you, sir. We'll just, oh, I see we are zoomed in on.
Yeah, it's a bit scary, but we'll manage.
I don't know whether that's good or bad.
Draw your own conclusions.
I don't want to. Okay, so I'm not going to speak to my submission or the written submissions that were filed by Ms. Parkinson. I've got a 4-page summary, which I'll speak to. We've provided you with a copy. If you don't
You've
have
just received a copy of that, thank you.
It's really just for your reference. So I appear for Rangatahi Limited, Raglan Land Company Limited, and Scenic Properties Limited, who are collectively referred to as Rangatahi. So the submissions that have been made are on behalf of all those companies. Most of the planning issues between Rangatahi's planning witness and the Section 42A officer are agreed. I will address 3 points arising out of Rangatahi's requested relief. The first issue I'll address is Waikato 2070 and the fact that Rangatahi seeks to have an inclusion or an explanation of 2070 in the introduction to the proposed plan. The next point is spatial planning, and Rangatahi seeks provision under the strategic policy for Raglan for a spatial plan. Finally, in respect of the future urban zone, I just want to touch on the fact that Rangatahi seeks confirmation of Rangatahi South as part of the future urban zone for Raglan. So turning to my first point, which is reference in the introduction to the 2070 document. In my submission, this just makes sense. There's no moment in it, really. It's not dependent on specific relief sought. Rather, it's the Council's most recent growth strategy prepared under the LGA. It is a statutory growth strategy that the Council shall have regard to when preparing a district plan. It is a key consideration in the Council's Section 42A report on future urban and medium density zoning. It is one of the matters that the Commission has had regard to in the decision on Ohiniwai. And finally, it is a key consideration in respect of the economic evidence before you on Raglan. So I would imagine that the growth or 2070 has appeared before you many times over the course of these hearings, and it seems to me just sensible to include an explanation of it in terms of its relationship to the district plan. So I'd now like to turn to, would you like to deal with questions in respect of each of these points as I go, or at the end?
Well, let's us be flexible. You carry on, and if you don't mind, if anything burning, we'll ask you to pause, and otherwise we'll do it at the end. Is that okay?
That's fine by me.
Cool, thank you.
So, in my submission, a spatial plan for Raglan is overdue. The Council's proposed structure plan was withdrawn 10 years ago. And I remember at least you, sir, indicated during Plan Change 12 that it was your hope that the Council would get on and promulgate a new structure plan for Raglan as soon as possible. And I recall we had some indication that that was going to happen within 2 years. It hasn't happened. So the plan was intended to provide for the integration of Raglan's special character, infrastructure, cultural values, and new growth. The language may differ today, but it was intended to serve as a spatial plan for Raglan's growth. That's in essence what it was and what we're seeking now. Since withdrawal of the Raglan structure plan, subsequent reports have only served to confirm the need for a spatial plan for all of Raglan. Those are the technical reports that were prepared during Plan Change 12, which took a spatial planning approach to all of Raglan when it identified the Rangatahi Peninsula as appropriate for urban development and urban mixed zoning. And more recently, the Isthmus Special Character Study, which again calls for a comprehensive approach to Raglan's character. So a spatial plan is a high order document that identifies land suitable for urban growth, but taking into consideration such things as the infrastructure required to service it, connectivity, cultural values, landscape, and character. There will be other issues. There will be issues related to the environment in the coastal marine area that will come into play as well. But I'm just highlighting the ones that are driving the real need for one in Raglan at the moment. It would provide guidance to structure plans, as we now call them, which show how land will be developed on a smaller scale. So this smaller scale could range from an entire future urban zone to cadastral boundaries within a future urban zone to infill development within the existing urban zones. And there's development opportunities in all of those areas. It does not require resort to the first schedule of the RMA. Rather, a spatial plan could be prepared using the special consultative process under Section 83 of the LGA. This process was used for Future Proof 2017 and also for Waikato 2070. And in that respect, it would be a strategy that would need to be given regard under Section 74 of the RMA and in the first schedule planning process, which is the point I made in respect to the to 2070 under paragraph 4A. Oh no, sorry.
5A.
4B. So the LGA process would allow for consultation with the community and tangata whenua so that higher order planning for growth capacity could be informed by social, economic and cultural values. So there is a process that doesn't require us to go through another first schedule process to just set out the higher order objectives for Raglan. And I submit that as part of your delegated functions in respect of Section 31A and 31AA, a spatial plan would satisfy these functions in relation to the preparation of planning provisions for Raglan by providing an overview as to how integration is to be achieved and how to satisfy expected urban demand. I just note at 14 that the spatial plan relief is consistent with the policy directives of the National Policy Statement on Urban Development in terms of its requirement for responsiveness to long-term planning for growth capacity and better integrated planning for infrastructure. And it's also consistent at 15 with the objectives or the strategic objectives of the proposed plan. And I refer to 4.1.2 because it will ensure a consolidated settlement pattern in a compact urban form. And in respect of 4.1.7, it will ensure that Raglan's special character is enhanced by new growth and development. So the character is enhanced by new growth and development, not detracted from by new growth and development. I just want to address consistency with competitive markets, which is something that you will have considered in respect of the National Policy Statement. Policy 1 of the National Policy Statement is not limited to competitive markets. It's one of 6 criteria that you need to take into consideration. And those other considerations that I've been referring to in terms of integration, sound planning, infrastructure, are also addressed under Policy 1. So it should not receive undue weight in terms of your decision on Raglan's future growth. A distinction can be drawn the distinction is drawn in the High Court's Infinity Group decision, which I've attached to my outline of submissions. That distinction is between trade, competition, and the operation of markets. And this is quite important in terms of understanding any submissions in relation to the availability of land, and also in terms of where rangatahi is coming from in terms of a spatial plan. The policy directive to limit adverse effects on competitive markets is not concerned with addressing competition between land developers. That trade competition, or you cannot seek a change for a trade competition purpose, but you can seek changes that are intended to achieve legitimate resource management outcomes. And in this respect, competitive markets address the operation of the market for housing and business land, not specifically whether a submission is trade competition or not. That's an entirely separate issue. And that needs to be assessed on its own basis. Is a submission being made in order to, is it evident on the face of the submission that they're seeking to stop development, or is it evident on the face of the submission that they're seeking a resource management outcome? Rangatahi is seeking a resource management outcome, a legitimate resource management outcome. So in terms of the demand and supply analysis, Dr. Fairgray and the Council's economist are remarkably close. In terms of supply, Davey says in the short to medium term, 10 years, it's 1,103. Fairgray says it's 1,085. There's 18 dwellings separating them. In terms of demand, over that same short-term 10-year period, short to medium-term 10-year period, Davey says 802 in demand, and Fairgrave says 828. So there's 26 dwellings separating them. So on their evidence, the capacity for growth in Raglan is more than 20% that required by the national policy statement, or is more than the 40% competitive margin required under the statement for the short to medium term. The supply calculations are based on a variety of land holdings and landowners, including Rangatahi Peninsula, Flax Cove, Lorenzen Bay, and infill development, i.e. Including the town centre. So those calculations aren't based on one landowner or their land holdings. And it's totally incorrect to suggest otherwise. Dr. Fairgray and Dr. Davies' evidence indicates that market competition is provided for in the short to medium term. There is the 20% competitive buffer that you need. And in my submission, that means that there is time to prepare a spatial plan for Raglan. And I note that the experts have said one could be completed by 2023. So we're not talking about either a plan or a process that needs to hold up development for an inordinate amount of time. So I just want to turn finally to the future urban zone. Rangatahi seeks to have Rangatahi South, which is identified as the Alon Aputaro growth area under the Waikato 2017 document, zoned as future urban zone. The expert evidence and the Section 42A report confirm that this is the most appropriate outcome. So I'll just leave it at that. Other than to say the FUZ will enable, the future urban zone in general will enable future urban zoning consistent with higher order documents, including a spatial plan under the first schedule. I note that Rangatahi has supported the identification of Rangatahi South and Raglan West to Hutawai, and that should say as future urban zone, since the future urban zone was introduced post-notification. The reason for this is that it is consistent with Rangatahi's long-held view that there should be a spatial plan for Raglan's growth. As I've said, this is a legitimate resource management outcome that Rangatahi has sought for over 10 years, as evidenced during Plan Change 12. Rangatahi does not support the live zoning of Rangatahi South or Te Hutawai until such time as a spatial plan has been completed. It supports those areas as being made available subject to spatial planning for live zoning, but do the spatial plan first. That's the simple point. And if you're persuaded that you need to release additional land at the moment, that doesn't preclude having a spatial plan. Don't knock out a spatial plan just because for some reason you're convinced that it would be better to have some additional land. So that concludes my submissions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McGill. Let's see if there are any questions for you. Mr. Marg?
No, nothing from me. Thank you. Very clear.
Ms. Sedgwick?
I have no questions since Dr. McGill appeared to answer them as I thought of them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Gibb?
No, thank you.
Ms. Teoho?
Thank you. No, it's very clear what you're proposing.
Mr. Fulton?
Just one question of area for a structure plan. We talk about Raglan and then we talk about Wainui and we talk about Whale Bay and all that area. Where are you talking about a structure plan that would include beyond or taking in all the coast up as far as I don't know, as far up as Whale Bay or something like that? Is that part of the
Ideally, yes. Ideally, yes. Because you need to plan for all of Raglan.
So yeah, that's what I'm trying to establish, is that it's a much bigger area than just the Raglan Township. It's the Raglan coast as well?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah, we don't mean to limit it, but character has been a pressing issue for some time. But as I acknowledged, there are other issues that need to be comprehensively looked at. And just the direction signalled at a high level so that we know where we're going, rather than allowing further piecemeal development that doesn't respond to some comprehensive goals.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Cooney?
There's a few questions, Dr. McGill. What was the scope of your submission vis-a-vis the Conan block? What did you oppose the live zoning of that? What was the relief you sought?
Originally, we supported it, I understand, but when the fuzz became available, Rangatahi changed its position, evidentially, which it's entitled to do. So it went from a submission that wasn't informed by a host of experts through to evidence on the proposed plan and the need for a spatial plan that is reflective of the evidence that has been produced. So in terms of scope, there's nothing, or there's no reason why Rangatahi can't change its view on the basis of evidence. And Ms. Parkinson is furiously scribbling something. Would you like to add to that?
I won't come into the picture. Just to add to that, that the further submission was support for the zoning that had been sought, subject to spatial planning being completed first.
That was your further submission, was it?
That was the further submission, yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. This need for a spatial plan, you proceeded with your development without a spatial plan, didn't you?
No, that's a misapprehension, and it comes through in the evidence that a spatial planning exercise was essentially undertaken as part of the Rangatahi plan change in order to identify Rangatahi as suitable. And that was acknowledged during the hearing, that there was a lot more evidence about the wider Raglan character and infrastructure and a whole lot of issues that the commissioners couldn't make decisions on, would have liked to, indicated that they would have liked to, but the structure plan had been withdrawn. Nevertheless, Rangatahi produced evidence that essentially undertook a spatial planning exercise.
Over the whole area?
Yes.
Well, why is there a need to do one now if you've already done the work?
Because it's not baked into the plan, sir. The reports are out there, but nobody's done anything about it.
Okay. If you're putting so much emphasis on the need for a wider spatial plan, why even rezone your land future urban and the Coning land? Because as I mentioned earlier, that forecloses on all the options, doesn't it?
I don't think it forecloses on the options. My understanding, and that's really an evidential question, I think, but my answer to that would be, well, it's been through an assessment process that has been agreed to between the experts, insofar as that's the logical extension of Raglan, and that's predicated on some work that was done as a result or during Plan Change 12. So it's not new, and I think what they're saying is, you know, before you release or live zone that land, at least let's identify where the roads are going to be through it, how it's going to be serviced by infrastructure, whether we have rules as Coning are seeking, which are just a reflection of the stock standard rules, or whether we have something that's more bespoke, like you do at Rangatahi, and reflective of the various values that need to be responded to, including tangata whenua.
You can do that at the subdivision stage, can't you? You know, you've got a block of land there that's sitting, it's not in the middle of town, it's some distance out. It's very similar to the sort of location where your land is. So all that can be dealt with at the subdivision stage. We know what the infrastructure matters are. We know what the special character in a general sense is. So I'm sort of putting to you, Doctor, aren't you tending to overstate the value of the spatial plan?
Well, not if you know it all and you haven't made any provision to recognise, or the council hasn't made any provision to recognise those issues in the proposed plan. If you know it all, my first response to you is, well, why aren't you reflecting it in the plan for Raglan? And secondly, I don't see how I'm in court over 1,000 lot subdivision at the moment, in the Environment Court for Hamilton, Amberfield. And we don't know all of the future roading that goes there, but there is a high level structure plan that indicates where all the roading should go. That can be tinkered with over time, but at the moment we don't have a clear indication of where roads will go, how infrastructure is going to be satisfied, you know, whether the one-way bridge can accommodate traffic. There's a whole lot, and tangata whenua. I mean, you know, you're going to hear from Ms. Greensill, who's going to speak for Tainui Hapu shortly, and she'll raise her own points in respect of this. She'll say, yes, you know it, but you haven't done anything about it.
All right. Just on the demand versus capacity debate, would you like to comment on the issue? The national policy statement, urban development, doesn't say that each town must have sufficient capacity to meet demand, does it? It's the district that must have sufficient capacity. Do you agree with that, or have you?
Can you point me to what you're referring to, so that we're talking to the same provision?
Well, I'm asking you a general question as to the scope of the NPS. on urban development and what its directions are. And what I'm saying is, it doesn't say that each town must have sufficient capacity, does it? If you look at it closely. Or do you want more time to come back to me on that?
I'm just, if you give me a quick moment, I'll just have a look at.
Do you want some reference?
Yeah, a reference would help. I mean, I see.
Okay, have a look at paragraph, the direction in paragraph 310. It says the local authority must assess demand for housing in urban environments and development capacity in the district to meet that demand. That's one reference.
Okay, so can I answer that? I understand that there's some debate. If Raglan is an urban environment, then you would be required to, because Waikato District Council is a Tier 1 council. If you accept the planner's report that it's not an urban environment, then that margin isn't required.
Well, let me take you through some more provisions, because my reading of it doesn't. But you know, I'm really putting this.
Can we just pause on that? Can you explain to me why, if it's, I mean, we have, if it's an urban area, it's an urban area.
Yeah.
Within the district.
Let me put to you other provisions, and let me see what your response is. In 324, the HBA assessment must assess demand in different locations. And in 325, it must assess capacity. In other words, the number of dwellings in different locations, including existing and new in urban areas. So that supports your argument. But it doesn't then translate my reading of it into that those particular areas must provide sufficient capacity at the end of the day.
Well, so can I cut to the chase? I actually agree with you insofar as we've just taken a belts and braces approach. I don't think Raglan particularly needs to demonstrate a competitive margin myself, for the reasons you've given. But our evidence has gone there to show you that we've taken a belts and braces approach in terms of, you know, supply versus demand, so that you can be comforted that it's satisfied. I'm certainly not advancing the proposition generic or in Raglan that it must apply. I accept that your interpretation is open as well.
Oh, thanks, mate. Look, that's just my view. That's why I'm asking the lawyers why have a dog and bark yourself. So that's why I've sort of invited.
I think that's a bit cheeky asking the lawyers, sir.
Well, anyhow, I'll be asking Mr. Lang the same question.
Thank you,
sir. Yeah, it seems that from when you look at it closely, you could have sufficient demand built into, as I mentioned earlier, Pocono, for example, and have it all centered there, or capacity up there, which I don't think is a good thing. But anyhow,
I think you could, and there may be good future-proof reasons for centralising, you know, how you accommodate that growth.
Yeah.
In terms of infrastructure. So I actually agree with your view.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily apply to Raglan.
I'm raising it because we've got this argument between the economists and the planners as to, well, what does the demand and capacity all say? And we sort of get into quite a complex little argument. And I suppose I'm saying, well, does it really matter in the end of the day, as long as we've got a sort of a general overview of what comes out? So hence my questions on that. But can I just move on to...
Can I just note that I agree with your summary and adopt it.
Okay. Thanks, Doctor. Just on, you say that the policy should be amended to direct that a spatial plan be sought within, I think, 2 or 3 years, 2023. We can't, you can't have a policy that makes that type of direction, can you?
You can't direct that it can, but what you can do, and I have to go to the specific wording of the policy, but you can say, well, development in these areas or this kind of development should not precede the completion of a spatial plan.
Yeah, you can have a high level, you can have a high level policy, and I think the courts have said policies can be, say, what a lot of things, but
yes.
But I don't know whether it can say that the council's got to go and do this by a certain date. It's like saying, well, having a policy to say your wastewater must be done by a certain date. That's just it'd be ultra vires, I would imagine.
I think you're right, and I think it needs to be worded as a higher order policy rather than being directive in a way that might make the council ultra vires itself.
All right, thanks, Doctor. Thank you.
Just one from me, Dr. McGill, and it's quite a simple question, I think. If a spatial plan is fundamental, and I think that's what your submission is saying, why would you even do fuzz zoning now absent that structure plan? Because you're almost picking a winner ahead of the analysis that you say is so fundamentally important.
Well, listen, I'd have to defer to the experts on that because I think I understand your point, but I think they will say, well, the areas that have been identified are really the only directions in which Raglan can credibly go, given its topography, and that those areas have been identified as fuzz because they are the closest areas to town that could credibly accommodate some kind of development, taking into account the landform.
If that's the case, then, just following on from what Mr. Cooney said, what's a spatial plan going to do that we don't already know? And why couldn't we live zone it all now, subject to appropriate infrastructure and so on and so forth?
Well, I think the reason is that you need to think about it holistically in terms of, well, how's it going to be serviced by roading? How's it going to integrate with landform, with cultural values, with existing township? I mean, do you have the evidence before you to enable you to make those decisions?
Well, I guess we've got to. That's fair. We've got to weigh the evidence.
Yes,
but that's a different proposition from saying there needs to be a spatial plan before any of that can be done. Surely, especially given that you've said there's nothing that you've said these are the only two areas that have been identified given topography and so on and so forth. So, I mean, I would have thought there's a logical argument that says get on and do it, and don't put the roadblock of a spatial plan in the way of doing that, because it's going to lead to the same outcome.
The same outcome being?
The same outcome being that these are the only two areas of developable land that have been able to be identified.
I think you'll find that Rangatahi's evidence is there's still a lot of questions as to how you open that land up for development and how you open it up in relation to roading, in relation to sewerage, in relation to a whole host of other matters that would have been dealt with at a granular level on Rangatahi, but aren't before you at the moment, and they were dealt at a granular level because a spatial plan was prepared. And I think that's the key message, and it's not just a spatial plan for the fuzz, it's a spatial plan for Raglan. So it's identifying, I know, for example, there are people that want to increase the height limit within the business area. to provide for more housing in there. You know, a spatial plan could look at those kind of issues and say, well, where are the opportunities in Raglan to provide it, and how should it be rolled out? That's the point of a spatial plan. It's not put there to be an impediment to development. It's intended to enable development to occur in an integrated way.
Why can't a district plan do that?
Well, it should, but it doesn't. I mean, this is the entire point, sir. I mean, we've sought a structure plan or a spatial plan for Raglan, and one was being promulgated 10 years ago, and then it was withdrawn. And my point is, let's do it now while you've got a window to do it, because if you release a whole lot of development now, I'd say the opportunity to shape what Raglan looks like going into 2070 is probably lost from a planning perspective.
Right. Thank you. That's helpful.
Thank you, sir. Can I just go through the order of witnesses I intend to call?
Sure.
Quite quickly. So David Peacock, who's the landowner. I will then be calling Angeline Greensill. Angeline is presenting, we've called Angeline under Rangatahi, but she's presenting evidence for Tainui Hapu. And you'll appreciate the distinction there, sir. She's not presenting evidence for Rangatahi per se. Then Dr. Fairgray, James Lundy, Rachel DeLambert, Ray Callahan, Ian Clark, and rounding up with Ben Inga.
Very good. Thank you very much. Mr. Peacock, welcome.
Hello. You took the first slide.
Sorry. Mr. Peacock's going to speak to some slides, sir.
Thank you.
Just checking this is the right one. Apologies, I'll just
I'll start.
Yes.
Raglan is, hello, I'm David Peacock. Raglan is a beautiful town with an outstanding surrounding natural environment. There'll be a short slide show which will show some of the things that I wanted to talk to there. There's a photo of Raglan in the distance around the edge of the harbour. This photo is just a wider landscape photo, but it does show how Raglan as a township doesn't stand out. It sits in amongst trees and peninsulas.
I don't think we can see that yet, Mr. Peacock. We can see the screen with a presentation heading on it, but it doesn't look like it's been opened. If it is, it's on the wrong screen.
Okay, we'll have that up shortly.
Yeah.
If it's of any help, I have it in front of me now.
Yeah,
okay,
can we, yeah, let's not do it ourselves. Let's the hearing administrator take us to the pictures.
Can everyone see that?
Not yet. We can still see, well, I can only see
Just stop sharing. Okay.
the Auckland boardroom screen, whoever's that is.
I'll stop sharing, sir.
There we go. That's got it.
Okay, it is important for Rangatahi and Raglan to plan for future growth, and spatial planning is an important start to that process, followed by structure planning. We have set a pattern of development on Rangatahi, which can be duplicated elsewhere in Raglan. We have developed the easier land and enhanced and preserved remnant native forests, wetlands, and the harbour edge to preserve and enhance residents' lifestyles. We have remained engaged and aligned with the local hapu, tainui and mahanga. I think that the spatial planning would provide certainty and set a framework for future growth. The planning of infrastructure is very important, including, in Raglan, water storage, wastewater treatment, where the water goes after that wastewater treatment, alternative access back to Highway 23, possible access between the Rangatahi Peninsula and Wainui Road. There's still, some uncertainty about where that road will go. Obviously, the Koning structure plan has a certain route, whether that's the best route, and whether it provides certainty for other land that adjoins Rangatahi and Konings. The one-lane bridge, it's important to understand when that's going to be provided, the upgrade. If we could move on to the next photo, I wanted to run through and just show some patterns of development which I've been involved in Raglan, which show, in my view, a pattern of development which is worth duplicating elsewhere. It's some examples of development that fit into the natural landscape. We've got here a picture of a property owned by Wainui Road Limited, which has a cafe, a Rocket Cafe, Wainui Landing Apartments, some offices that Wainui Environmental operate out of, a Let's Grow Child Care Centre, and a Raglan Rock tourism venture. On business zone land on Wainui Road and the corner of Rurakiriopa Drive. Housing development, if you could switch on to the next one. Some housing development in the area, which is from a landscaping point of view, the houses are melt into native plantings, so as to not be a blight on the landscape. There's an example here above Rangatahi of various houses hidden away in amongst native planted areas, refurbished wetlands, and gully systems that are very low quality soils. The next one is Wainui Environmental, their workspace, an engineering and planning business which has approximately 12 employees who really do live the live, work and play thing of, they're obviously involved in projects in Australia and the wider Waikato in New Zealand and in Raglan. So it's it's the way of the future for Raglan, if you like, that people can live in Raglan and work in various professional spaces. The Let's Grow Childcare Centre, which has been had a waiting list since the day it opened, and we've made it bigger, and it's still got a waiting list. We will build one of these on the peninsula at a later date. The next photo is some apartments which are on the same property, which are rented out on Airbnb, which fit in with the adjoining buildings and not obtrusive to the environment. The next one is the bridge and the causeway over onto the peninsula and the developing Rangatahi Peninsula. We are trying to maintain its natural character. We're enhancing the plantings around the edge of the harbour and the valley systems and the remnant native bush. Could move on to the next one. Okay, a local family who were the first ones to purchase a section from Rangatahi, and their house is, since this photo was taken, they're about a month away from moving in. If you look at the stats, there were 40% of the land that we've sold so far has been bought by local families to build new homes. Yeah, going to the next one, we've got a temporary social hub, the Hut Cafe and our Rangatahi sales office. It's on a comprehensive lot in the first stage. We are planning to build a new cafe across the road from this, which which does provide that sense of atmosphere. This little cafe has gone from being, opening a few months ago to being tremendously popular with not just with people who are associated with the peninsula, but with Raglan families who come and utilise the walking tracks and the aesthetics and observe everything there is to observe on the peninsula. All of the planting, the street landscape is all native and wide, is widespread across the peninsula. The next one is a public park with a boardwalk, which the new cafe will be on the southern side of this, overlooking this. This will be the social hub of the peninsula. That'll be there in approximately a year's time. But it's an important part of what's happening there. Yeah. You can see some limestone walkways around the edge of the harbour. Families can come over on the peninsula and their kids can literally, disappear into, a beautiful place to spend some time. Obviously, there's been there's been a huge number of builds. I think there's 40 odd houses being built as we speak. It's provided a lot of employment to local tradesmen. And part of the aesthetics, there's spaces which are not going to be developed into housing and amongst the housing precincts, which we've developed various orchards which are intended to be used by residents or Raglan or whoever turns up and has a walk around. So there's an avocado orchard there, and there's also, flicking through the slides, there's some vineyards, and as we're about to plant an olive grove this winter. There's also some community gardens with citrus trees. And here we go. It's 42 houses started, 6 complete. To maintain our established pattern of development into the future, Rangatahi and Raglan need spatial planning, followed by structure planning. I hope that we can make progress on this through the present process. So thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Peacock. Let's see if there are any questions. Mr. Fulton?
No, I don't have any questions. Thank you.
Ms. Tiaho?
No questions from me. Thanks for the lovely picture.
Ms. Gibb?
No, thank you, but I do appreciate seeing where you've got to so far. Thank you.
Ms. Sedgwick?
I do have one question, and yes, also thank you for the photographs. In your conclusion, you talked about the existing Rangatahi structure plan, and you mentioned an extension to that structure plan. Would you consider that to be the trigger then to turn a future urban zone into live zoning, or are you suggesting that that is not the trigger and you would still wait for a spatial plan?
Well, I think I doubt whether infrastructurally we could do any more development over the present zoned area, because there isn't infrastructure for extra development in my view. So I think the future urban zone, there are questions that need to be answered before that could be live zoned.
Right. Okay. No, I'm clear on where you're going with that. Thank you.
Mr. Mark?
Fantastic presentation, Mr. Peacock, but I have no questions.
Mr. Kearney?
Yes, no questions. Yeah, nice touches to your subdivision, Mr. Peacock. Well done.
Absolutely.
And I have no questions. Thanks, Mr. Peacock. Thank you for your presentation and your evidence.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. If we could join Ms. Greensill, if she's on. Is she on?
Not that I can see. Oh, there she is. Yes, she is. Ms. Greensill, you're ready to rock and roll.
Kia ora. Morning, Commissioners. Thank you for allowing me to speak to my submission. I'm just going to summarise some of the points made in my evidence.
Would you be able to turn your video on, Ms. Greensill, by any chance, please?
I'm sorry, my camera's broken.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll have to stare at the blank screen, but that's okay. We can have a look at the picture of Mr. McGill again, Dr. McGill again.
So as Mr. McGill has pointed out, I'm not here to speak for Rangatahi Limited. I'm actually here to speak and give evidence on behalf of our hapu, whose lands are affected by lots of things in Raglan, especially the Rakonui block, which Te Hutiwai or the Coney property is part of. It's adjacent to Rangatahi. I do have a, oh no, it doesn't matter, I won't show that. In my evidence, I referred to supporting a structure planning approach to future urban growth in Raglan. And this is, as has already been pointed out, structure planning was discussed way back in 2012 or something, and we still haven't got there, in my view. So to actually have a structure planning approach would enable us to engage and exercise our kaitiakitanga, to ensure that development in Raglan proceeds with appropriate provision for the protection of our cultural values, and to assist in realising our aspirations for our own land, because we also have housing aspirations. I understand that the terminology used by Rangatahi in the evidence is a Raglan spatial plan. I think it's important to spatially recognise cultural values across Raglan prior to enabling further residential zoning. This needs to include adequate provision for identifying areas of cultural value across Raglan as opposed to heritage sites. So we've heard from archaeologists, and in some cases, especially the Coney property, we have not, I was unaware that there was a development going ahead until I'd read the submissions. So that's an issue that needs to be addressed, because Rakonui in that Te Hutiwai block was actually occupied by our people who are there and other things on their property. Protecting cultural information not suitable for release in the public domain. We have difficulties in producing maps with our stuff on them, because lots of people are still going out grave robbing, unfortunately, in the community. So we are grappling with that at the moment. We've just been dealing with hapu management plans and trying to work out how we can map our spaces and values in a way that they are also protected. And we've decided that we'll have two plans, one for us and one for everyone else, as a way to overcome that. Another issue of concern is the need to spatially identify a culturally appropriate wastewater treatment system and any land requirements prior to rezoning land in or around the future urban zone areas, especially Te Hutiwai, because that's where the actual wastewater treatment plant is at the moment. And so that's just to the northern end of the Coney property. We're continuing to engage with Council and Watercare on their proposed wastewater upgrades with a view to identifying land suitable for discharge to land. The present discharge is highly inappropriate from a cultural spiritual perspective and has been for almost 5 decades. We want to see an integrated approach taken to the development and infrastructure that takes into account cultural and spiritual values. We have an expectation that there will be engagement and opportunities for hapu to contribute to growth plans for Raglan, and for us, consultation needs to be early and meaningful. And can I say that in terms of Rangatahi, that was the case. We were there from the beginning, before, when it was a paddock. We walked over that property and cut out all the cultural sites. We have actually named all the streets, and we have had an ongoing presence in any stage of development that has occurred there. And that's a type of consultation that actually works. So in comparison to that, I'm concerned that there's evidence that's been filed by the Coney Family Trust, who I know, I've known Martin Coney for some years, that they have consulted with Tangata Whenua. I'd be really interested to find out who they have consulted with, because I am the representative on environmental matters for this particular land and for the Tainui hapu, and I really don't know much about it. I've never been for a walk on this property to see what is proposed. So consultation needs to be undertaken. And while it talks about these matters, and some of the experts have given, have quoted contradictory statements really about consultation, I can assure you that that has not happened in this case, which is unfortunate, because the whole of that Rakanui block is close enough to town for housing purposes. And I guess the Waikato, was it 1970 plan? I can't think when it was now. No, that's not right. 2070 plan has actually shown places where there should be development. They've actually excluded a place that is quite close to that Māori are wanting to develop for housing, 20 houses, Papakainga. And so that's something else to take into account in terms of planning for urban spaces. I guess Māori people are starting to come home in our territory. I had a meeting with 30 the other day that have been, they disappeared in 41. They're wanting to come home and use their lands. And so we will be actually building our own little Papakainga dwelling spaces on our land that is remaining, which is mainly Whanga Coast. Rakonui, which is the block between Rangatahi and Te Huriwai, and Te Kopua. So that's just a heads up on where we will be putting housing, affordable housing for our people in the future. So basically that's all I have to say. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much, Ms. Greensill. Let's see if we have any questions for you. Ms. Tiaho.
No, kia ora te whaia. No, karakau he pātai he mihi noa I hoki a koe, mi au kōrero. Nothing for me, just a mihi to Angeline.
Kia ora, thank you.
Ms. Gibb.
No questions, but I do thank you, Angeline, for explaining what you've done to us. Thanks very much.
Ms. Sedgwick.
No, thank you. Nothing from me.
Mr. Marg.
Kia ora, Angeline, nothing from me, but great to hear from you.
Thank you.
Mr. Fulton.
Yeah, no, I have no questions. Thank you very much.
Mr. Cooney.
No, thank you.
No, and I don't have any questions either. Thank you very much, Ms. Greensill.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Which I think brings us to Dr. Fairgray.
Good morning, Commissioners, and kia ora.
Good morning. Just. It's a minute to 12.
Just got that in. I'll get through as quickly as I can. I just note that in making my comments here, I'm agreeing to comply with the expert witness code of conduct. Again.
Thank you.
Firstly, I'll summarise what I've done fairly quickly. My evidence addressed expected demand for housing and housing land in Raglan and its immediate surrounds. And that's into the short, medium and long term. And I also looked at the estimated capacity to provide for housing demand. And the key points from my evidence are as follows. Firstly, there's solid demand for housing expected in Raglan into the long term. And that demand we made up from demand for resident households to live in Raglan, which is about 3/4 of the total, and demand for holiday homes from those who usually live outside Raglan, and that makes up around another 1/4. I examined the capacity to accommodate expected housing demand, both from infill and greenfield development, and that took into account existing and proposed zonings and land areas. And I also drew on the capacity estimates in the first Section 42A report, because those estimates were very close to my own. I compared expected demand with estimated capacity for housing, and I conclude that there will be sufficient capacity in Raglan to accommodate demand until at least the mid-2030s in a high growth future, and into the mid-2040s or later in a medium growth future. And my demand and supply comparison is summarised in a figure 3 of my evidence in chief. But I also concluded that taking into account the expected growth in resident households and demand for holiday dwellings and the capacity estimates, that there is need to provide for additional housing capacity in the long term. The projections indicate demand for dwellings will be catered for into the 2030s. However, in the longer term, and/or if housing growth is substantially faster than projected, the available capacity will reduce and potentially be exhausted. I concluded that the proposed future urban zone to provide for additional capacity represents an appropriate response to cater for growth into the medium term. And I emphasise the word "and," not just the appropriate response, because I'd see it as part of a wider response. I support a comprehensive spatial planning approach for Raglan, and that's based on, firstly, opportunities for efficient urban expansion, being predominantly through incremental growth outward from the current edge, in locations suitable for urbanisation and residential use, and also according to the scale and sustained nature of projected growth, which indicates that Raglan will be between, say, 50% and 60% larger than it is now in the long term. And that's quite a substantial change, but not occurring immediately. But that scale of change, in my view, makes it important to develop a comprehensive and a long-term structure plan or similar for Raglan. And I note that this is directly in line with what I see as the so-called good planning provisions of the National Policy Statement on Urban Development. There has been some discussion around. I'm doing a number of studies on the National Policy Statement, and the comprehensive nature of that makes it important to look at a number of aspects of housing demand, including location and timing and the nature of that demand. So I see this more comprehensive approach as being directly consistent with the NPS. I also filed a couple of statements in evidence and reply. I first considered Mr. Colgrave's estimates of housing demand based on his massive shift towards working from home because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and his view that capacity would be less than expected because only a low proportion of plan-enabled capacity would be developed. And I noted that I disagreed with Mr. Colgrave's view that there will be significant shortfalls in supply, including because he did not, in my view, provide adequate evidence to support his contentions. In my second evidence and reply, I addressed the Section 42A framework report. I set out my concern that the additional requirement to accommodate housing growth in Raglan may be understated because there was no allowance for holiday dwellings and because the indicated capacity in the proposed medium density zone in Raglan is subject to considerable uncertainty, and its capacity may be substantially less than indicated. I also noted my disagreement with the conclusion in the Section 42A report on zone extents that the zoning of the coning land would give effect to the NPS UD provisions to support competitive land markets. And I noted that the competitive operation of land and development markets is rather more complex than just adding supply, and that a range of factors beyond just land area and supplier numbers need to be taken into account. I concluded that the definition of a competitive urban land market in the Randerson Review offers a much stronger and more appropriate basis for urban assessment. And I do note that in the NPS UD itself, there is no definition of what a competitive land and development market is. And I have asked the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development for such a definition, and they identify that they cannot provide me with one. Now, finally, I'll offer some comment on Mr. Colgrave's rebuttal statement of May 17, because I haven't had opportunity to respond to that in written form. Mr. Colgrave relied on capacity estimates, which he sourced through Dr. Davey, and he attributed those estimates to my company, Market Economics. He stated that they contradicted my estimates of capacity in Raglan. My company did provide Dr. Davey with preliminary estimates in December 2020, but those estimates had an explicit warning as to their draft nature as follows, and I'll read this out because I think it's quite important. Please find attached the file containing the draft, in capitals, parcel level outputs as requested. They are draft because they will change following feedback from the council, and also will be further calibrated, which can change results substantially once I get the developer information back from Waikato District. Also, I am still incorporating some of the information around Raglan. It doesn't yet contain the 500 lot cap on the Rangatahi Peninsula. And I would also like to make some further adjustments to the assumed densities there. So the Raglan results will change a lot. And I emphasise those last few words. Now, we've communicated with Dr. Davey following the release of Mr. Colgrave's rebuttal. And we asked him why those preliminary figures had been released. And Dr. Davey has replied as follows. Fraser, that is Mr. Colgrave, was told explicitly that the data is draft, still being worked on by ME, and that Rangatahi was overstated by circa 1,000 due to adjustments not yet being made. I exchanged a number of emails directly with Fraser on this, so I'm disappointed to hear this. So I note there is nothing in the assessment, this is my wording now, there is nothing in the assessments by me or by others in market economics which contradict the capacity estimates which I provided in my evidence in chief, in which I stand by. And I further note that I consider Mr. Colgrave's most recent capacity estimates have substantially understated the remaining capacity for dwellings in Raglan, because he assumes that once a section has been sold to a new owner, that it no longer has capacity for a dwelling. In my view, that is not accurate. It is only when the new owner builds a dwelling that the capacity is used up. I understand that 6 dwellings have been completed on lots in Rangatahi, which Mr. Peacock confirmed, not the 300 which Mr. Colgrave appears to assume. So in conclusion, I stand by my conclusions from my evidence in chief and my evidence in reply statements and my response to my verbal response to Mr. Colgrave's rebuttal. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Fairgray. Let's see if there's any questions for you. Mr. Marg?
No, nothing from me. Your evidence and reply was very helpful. Thank you.
Mr. Fulton?
No, I don't have any questions. Thank you, Mr. Hargrave.
Ms. Sedgwick?
No, I have no questions on what is quite a vexed question, but thank you.
Ms. Gibb?
Well, no real questions, but my confusion is how do we determine the number of houses needed for holiday dwellings versus permanent residence? And we just don't know, do we? We don't know when people purchase sections and build houses if it's for them personally or because they want to invest in the holiday market. So I'm confused over that, but that's just stating. If anyone has an answer for me, I appreciate it. Thank you.
If I may respond to that, because I've been looking at Raglan and other places, but looking at Raglan over quite a long time. And it's important to recognise it's an established community. The town's been there for a lot of years, and the results come through quite consistently over time that holiday dwellings make up about a quarter of the total demand. It's not just suddenly that's something that suddenly emerged. This is a long-term pattern, and Raglan is a long-term town. So what we've got in front of us at the moment is the result of 100 or 100 plus years of development and 100 years of demand and so on. So I'm very confident that the indication of the holiday home demand is quite solid. And I noticed from Mr. Peacock that his figures for the recent sales on his land indicates 23% of those sales were for people intending to develop holiday homes. So the figure of a quarter is pretty solid. And I also note that I've studied this not just in Raglan, but I've in the past taken a wide-ranging study from East Cape and Cape Egmont North up to North Cape, looking at the incidence of holiday dwellings and how those relate to the populations of our big cities. So the pattern is fairly strong and consistent. So it's quite, it's relatively straightforward to say, well, here's the growth in our big towns and cities, and this is the extent of holiday home demand that we can expect being generated from those cities, and that is consistent with what we're seeing in Raglan. So
Okay, thank you. That's really good to hear that. The other concern I have for rental accommodation, and the rhetoric we hear is there's never enough rental accommodation, especially in the holiday season, for temporary workers going into the hospitality industry to cope with those people that come in over that period, because there is a fluctuation. So that is possibly relating back to my thinking earlier about sufficient medium value properties to lower value properties available for rental accommodation. So we can't really determine that either very clearly, can we?
No. Well, there's decent information on the level of rentals in Raglan. Part of the issue is, of course, that there are seasonal fluctuations in Raglan. So at just the time when seasonal workers are wanting accommodation, the holiday home dwellers are there. Yeah. So that's a double peak. And from the rest of the year, there's less. It's less viable to own a dwelling which you rent out, because the demand is not there, or less demand is there during the rest of the year. So this is a common issue in all of the locations especially around the coast, where there's a strong seasonal component, and there's no easy solution to that.
No, thank you very much.
Ms. Tiaho?
Yeah, I do have a couple of questions, please. Just following on from Commissioner Gibbs' questions, wouldn't it actually be more beneficial in terms of affordability if there was competition in terms of the coning development?
Oh, certainly there is an effect of competition. I haven't seen any information on, for example, what the pricing of the coning development might be in relation to the pricing of the Rangatahi development, or in relation to the pricing of other dwellings and developments in Raglan. Secondly, it's always important to understand the context. I mean, there's a lot written about the difference between rural land prices and urban land prices from quite a number of studies which we've done and tracked the whole process. Your existing rural land component represents somewhere between 7 and 12% of your final value of a lot in an urban setting. One of the main reasons being that you can use urban land much more intensively than you can use rural land, and it's a lot more expensive to make urban land able to support that higher intensity of activity. So there's no sort of mystery there. Any development, any addition to supply does have some effect on competition and may have some effect on prices. We would expect that sort of as a matter of course, but it is not a silver bullet by any means. It's one of these things that needs to be considered in a lot more detail.
Thank you. The other question I have is, you talked about the growth in working from home, and I just wondered, is that a reference because I'm thinking about the supply side holistically. So we're looking at Raglan now, but if you look not very far away, 20 to 30 minutes away in Hamilton, you know, a lot of intensification in housing, and it's not that far away to travel to and from Raglan. You know, to visit the beautiful scenery, etc. And so have you kind of taken it and have you looked at all of those numbers in terms of demand and supply holistically by taking into account what is planned around Raglan and, for example, in Hamilton?
Yeah, and I think again I would say it's really important to recognise that Raglan has been there a long time, and most of the established patterns represent how demand has evolved over time. Raglan's not going anywhere, Hamilton's not going anywhere. The distance is always going to be the same. The impediment of distance is always going to be the same. So there are people who live in Raglan and work in Hamilton, and there always will be. And we would broadly expect that number to increase broadly in line with the growth in Raglan and having some influence as well with growth in Hamilton. But I think, that's a long-term pattern which we need to take into account. Certainly, there's been a lot more profile about working from home under the COVID restrictions, and there is yet to be any real evidence that there would be, or there has been a significant change. And most of the evidence I have seen is that people are staying in place. They're not shifting their house or shifting where they live to be able to work from home. They're just working from home in their existing house and going into their office or whatever less frequently. And so, relocating your whole dwelling and your whole household is a much bigger shift. And most of the response to COVID has been able to be accommodated just by staying where you are and going into the office or the factory or whatever less frequently. So I don't see it as a really big driver. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Kearney? Yes, Mr. Fairgrave, it's sort of almost a mantra you hear from politicians and through the press that local authorities are responsible for land prices, high prices of houses because they don't release enough land for development. And we've heard that over the last 5 years or so. So my question to you is, isn't it better to provide surplus capacity than have an under capacity available?
Yeah, I'd say two things to that, because I've been following that argument for quite a lot more than 5 years. I'd have to say, in my view, the RMA and planning has been blamed for perhaps much more of that effect than it probably deserves, or than it certainly deserves, because I'm one of the few people, I think, who's actually delved into that in quite a lot of detail, and it's an area of particular interest and concern for me. So there is always a balance between providing for sufficient capacity to make sure there isn't a constraint on capacity which will affect prices, and making sure that you don't impose too high costs on the people who will be buying that land and buying those dwellings. And one of the main costs is your infrastructure. So it's really important to get the timing right and the location right. And I think I made the point before that affordability is not just housing affordability, it's the whole of living affordability. And transport costs are a very big part of that. Not as big as housing costs, but transport costs are very significant. So, there's always a trade-off between developing out in much further from the city and the transport requirements of the household to live in those locations. And these sorts of things are quite a lot of what as I said, the good planning aspects of the National Policy Statement of Urban Development are trying to take into account. And I did note in my final reply that what I see is quite a very good approach in the Randerson report as to what constitutes a competitive land market, which tends to focus more on long-term efficiency and sustainability rather than just the direct competition between players in the market, because that direct competition is just a small part of the total market. So getting it right and doing the appropriate planning in terms of what happens where and when and how much, I think that is the key driver of keeping things like affordability right. And that's why, taking right back to the beginning, why I think a spatial planning approach, which is comprehensive, is really important. Because remember, we're looking not just short term, we're looking at 2070. So yeah, this future urban zone, which I think is a good idea, it's worked very well in Auckland. But those future urban zones will not by themselves be sufficient to accommodate Raglan's growth out to 2070. So if we're going to take a long-term perspective and a wide perspective, that's why I think a comprehensive approach like spatial planning is
I can understand your point about the need to have efficiencies in terms of the supply of infrastructure and to service developments. I can understand that, and it becomes more important the bigger the cities are, where you've got different directions in which to put infrastructure, and if it's not utilised in one direction and it's sitting there wasted and not paid for, etc. But when you get a small area like Raglan, that sort of issue becomes reduced, doesn't it?
Not really. One of the issues, of course, with infrastructure is that it's really expensive and there are quite big scale economies. And Raglan doesn't benefit from those scale economies. We look around the country, we see a lot of small communities faced with very high costs of water's infrastructure to upgrade that because they're relatively small and there are a number of fixed costs. So I think it sort of actually works in somewhat in reverse. But that's why I think getting those things right and having a long-term and wide view is a very good way of being able to get those things right.
All right. Just with the demand and capacity debate, you've been working with the NPS and the urban development, you've heard my questions of others about it. When you're looking at towns within the district, in the Waikato district, it's more of, doesn't it seem that from the NPS that you take an unders and overs approach to the actual townships, and at the end of the day, it's what capacity the district can provide overall? Isn't that the sort of thrust of the NPS?
No, I don't think so at all. I mean, certainly the NPS has been very big city focused. However, it does specifically make reference to location. And if we look at the economy of Waikato district, there's half a dozen towns, which are all quite different. And that's where the demand, which the NPS is required to cater for, that's where the demand will be directed. And so it's not going to be appropriate to say, oh, look, we're going to provide no more capacity in Raglan, you can go and live in Pocono instead. And I suspect the people who wanted to live in Raglan would be a little bit upset by that. So, and I'm not trying to be facetious, I'm just saying it's really important to take into account that growth is locally focused, and it has been for quite a long time. The towns have been there for a long time, and there is specific demand to live in Raglan, there's specific demand to live in Ngaruawahia, specific demand to live in Huntly. And we're in a very fortunate position in this day and age when there's good information at a refined geographical level, which allow us to say, okay, well, let's look at Raglan specifically for our NPS work, and let's look at Huntly specifically for our NPS work. And they're quite different, but we can do that in both cases. And I know we can do that because it takes up quite a number of hours of my time at night. But it is a very good process and a solid process.
Yeah, I agree with that. But and indeed, if you look at the HBA provisions, they tell you that you've got to do that. But then when you get that information, you can apply an overs and unders approach in terms of what capacity you provide, as long as there's sufficient capacity in the district. And that's the point I'm just trying to get some clarification on.
Yeah,
I've gone to the lawyers to try and help me on that, but it just seems to my reading of the various provisions, that seems to be the outcome, but I'm not an expert in that field.
yeah, that's, I suppose, part of the dangers of going to lawyers. Sorry, but you're sitting right there, I had to do it.
Yeah,
No, I'm sorry. I don't see that at all. I mean, demand is locally specific. The NPS requires consideration of location. Location is critical. Land use and the location of land use is critical. Part of the process of doing these HBAs is we do them for the councils, and then the councils take them along to MHUD, and MHUD come back and say yay or nay as to whether you've done it right. And I'd be extremely reluctant to produce an HBA for any of the areas we're looking at, to give that to the council and say, go along, we've only looked at growth at the aggregate level. In Rotorua, we're looking at Rotorua urban plus the small settlements. In Napier and Hastings, we're looking at the two main cities and the smaller settlements. In Queenstown, same issue. Hamilton, same issue. And I think Waikato district is quite unique across New Zealand because its major population centres are all small. It's a rural area between two big cities. So all of its big population bits are in relatively small towns. So, and all those towns are different.
I don't want to get too much into this debate because, my proposition to you makes sense when you're dealing with the big cities like Auckland, doesn't it? Because you've got those areas like the North Shore, you've got Epsom areas, and where do you take the demand from? It's the overall approach that you've got to look at.
Well, again, no, it's not. When you add everything up, that's an overall approach. But to get to the point of adding everything up, you need to look at location. I mean, location is never neutral. It's a fundamental of any sort of planning. Location is never neutral, time is never neutral. So we have to look at demand by location, and the NPS requires us to do that.
Okay. All right. Now, interesting point. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Fairgray. I don't have any questions. Thank you.
Sir, I know we're scheduled to break, but Mr. Lambert has some time constraints. I was wondering whether we could squeeze her in before lunch.
Yeah, I think so. We have read, as I say, we have read her her various documents. So yeah, that will be fine.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Lambert. Just when you're ready. Thank you. Welcome.
Kia ora tātou, and thank you for that. And I will attempt to be efficient. There is a presentation, and I don't know if the council person can get that up. I prepared that some time ago in February, and I don't intend to speak specifically to each slide, but I will sort of gallop through parts of it just to provide some continuity with what else I'm going to say. So hello, and obviously I am Rachel Lambert, landscape architect, and my evidence addresses the sort of the landscape related matters for Rangatahi.
Rachel, would you like for us to identify what that document is, or?
No, we're aware of that. That's okay.
You've got it, right.
I think it's going to come up with any luck as well.
Thank you.
If it does, I'll try and get somebody to jump through some of the slides at a, yep, there it is. Thanks. Yeah, my evidence is closely related to that of James Lunday, who will follow me. And just acknowledging also that I have done various pieces of work for Rangatahi Limited since around 2010. So
obviously involvement in the plan change in respect of Rangatahi Peninsula. So just my first point, and it has been acknowledged by pretty much everybody this morning, but Rangatahi, at least Raglan, is, in my opinion, a special settlement. It does have a character and amenity that's recognisably different from other Waikato towns, and it's valued because of that difference. And the qualities that make Rangatahi Raglan special, in my opinion, are fragile, and that they can be lost if growth isn't well managed and appropriately managed. And it is my opinion that what is needed to ensure that growth supports and strengthens Raglan's character and amenity is this overarching spatial plan for the settlement as a whole, and that needs to be independent of land ownership and set a framework for high quality future growth or quality future growth. Now, if you just jump to slide 2, and I'll just carry on speaking for a bit on this slide. In my opinion, it is time now for Raglan to get it right, and if essentially it doesn't get it right now, then that opportunity will be lost. The evidence of Doug Fregrey and Ben Inga on behalf of Rangatahi is that there is ample zoned land available to accommodate growth for the next 10 years. And this timeframe gives council ample opportunity to undertake a spatial planning exercise before further land is live zoned. Furthermore, much of the groundwork for spatial planning for Raglan is in place, and it's actually quite recent work as well, including the work that Council commissioned ISMIS to undertake, the Raglan Character Study, April 2020, as well as the Raglan Naturally Community Plan 2020. They are both key documents to inform the spatial planning exercise. And the value of a comprehensive settlement-wide spatial plan, as opposed to going straight to landowner-led structure plans, in my opinion, includes the fact that this process will enable appropriate engagement with Waikato Tainui through hui and other means, as well as engagement with submitters and the wider community. It will enable the identification of the necessary network of roads, walk and cycleways with multiple options for connectivity, as well as open space to ensure well-connected, walkable and easy to get around settlement with alternative routes of access and linkages. It will enable the well-planned distribution of smaller local centres to support walkable neighbourhoods and local amenity while supporting the town centre of Raglan as the primary retail destination within the town. Will also ensure that landscape and ecological linkages, including the connection of the Maunga, Mount Karioi, to the Moana via its various coastal and harbour catchments. And ensure enhanced natural character and natural character of the coastal environment and outstanding natural landscape outcomes. It will assist in recognising the urban form characteristics that set Raglan apart from other Waikato settlements and suggest a future urban structure that can secure a form of growth that maintains the distinctive urban qualities of Raglan. And it will also assist in clarifying the staging and managed release of land to deliver infrastructure. In my opinion, without an overarching spatial plan at the scale of the settlement as a whole, there's a very real risk of growth detracting from the special qualities of Raglan. However, with time taken to undertake a spatial plan, I consider Raglan's considerable growth can be managed to secure beneficial outcomes. And I note that the evidence of Mr. Inga is that a spatial plan could be in place for Raglan by 2023, which is a short time to wait in order to get Raglan's long-term growth right. Now, I've just run through now a series of the slides, and I guess these next sort of 5 images are looking at some of the wider spatial planning work that
Sorry.
That's all right. Robert gets the prize for having his phone on in the hearing, so that's good. We're all off the hook now. Yeah, just sort of running through these. And so this is part of the historical work that has been done around just understanding this bigger picture framework for Raglan. So if you can just move through these quite quickly in terms of the catchments, the land cover qualities, some of the land use capability, Keep going. Obviously, slope analysis is important to inform structural planning and future spatial growth. And keep going. If you just, this is the archaeological information. So if you just rest on this next slide. And I guess this just summarizes some of the points that I've already made, and I know this is in the evidence, so again, I won't rest on it in any great sense. So if we just then move again, so the next slides, and perhaps if you just toggle back and forth between this and the next one, is just some analysis around the growth that has occurred over the last 10 years between 2011 and now. And you can see some of that growth is planned, but also there's quite a lot of ad hoc growth in Raglan. And then if you just jump again to the next two slides, which do the same thing, just at a finer scale in terms of lot size and houses. And I think this is something that the commissioners, if you want to come back and just have a look at spatially how some of that change is occurring over time, this GIS analysis helps you look at that. So then just coming back to, I guess, and if you just keep moving through the slides, I'll just get you to, so key in a landscape sense is Raglan's relationship to Mount Karioi and the Maunga to the water relationships. And so this slide and then the next three just really pick up and summarise some of those special attributes of Raglan. You just keep going. The way housing is set into the landscape is a key attribute, and keep going. And if you just, sit on the next slide, because this is now really coming to 2070 and this question of future growth across Raglan. So the identification, with respect to the future urban zone and the identification of land, which will be essentially the next cab off the rank in terms of the urban growth of Raglan as a future urban zone, it is appropriate as a planning tool, in my opinion, to identify fuzz in advance of those as a path to live zones. And in this respect, I consider both Rangatahi South and the Tutuai structure plan areas to be appropriate land to be zoned fuzz at this time. Once the spatial plan is in place, I consider the next steps to realise line zone for these areas would entail comprehensive structure planning, including delivering the outcomes identified through the spatial plan and a related finer grain level of master planning. And as I noted in my evidence in chiefs, these cascading scales of comprehensive planning for greenfield growth have been adopted in other locations, such as Drury, Pukekohe and Pairata, but also in Hamilton with the Peacock structure plan, and then Amberfield in terms of the residential subdivision. So in terms of Rangatahi South, and if you just move to the next slides, and we'll just jump through these really quickly again to talk about some analysis that once the fuzz was identified in the Section 42A report, we did some work to look at analysis of the southern portion of Rangatahi and the potential for a future urban zone there. This is the sort of analysis that have informed, and if we just keep stepping through that, so slope analysis, obviously, extent of existing zonings, archaeological areas, inundation areas. I think the next one is around existing covenants, and just keep going. So just landing here in terms of identifying both within the existing area of the Rangatahi zone and extending that to the south. So we've identified 51 hectares of land to the south, which we're proposing as a future urban zone. And that area, and in addition to the area within the southern portion of the Rangatahi zone, we identify would generate approximately 30 hectares of land for further development. So just in summarising, I've undertaken a further landscape analysis of the land to the south of the current Rangatahi Peninsula zone, and undertaking this work and related review of the southern portion of Rangatahi, it's my opinion that 51 hectares of contiguous land to the southern boundary can be zoned fuzz. By extension, the Rangatahi Peninsula zone to the south in this way and reviewing the development potential within the southern portion of the zone in order of 30 hectares, which is some 370 to 460 dwellings at between 12 to 15 dwellings per hectare could be realised. And I note that the Section 42A report for the zone extents recommends accepting the Rangatahi Southern phase. So in terms, just turning to the Koning Family Trust Raglan rezoning development plan document, their structure planning and their other structure plan, in my opinion, these do lay good foundations for the future growth of this western part of Raglan. However, I consider they would be better informed by a wider spatial plan, which could then be reflected in the more detailed master planning for these areas of land. I consider the Tutuai structure plan developed by the Konings misses some important and necessary growth planning opportunities, such as ensuring a robust and appropriate settlement-wide roading and multimodal connectivity, ensuring that local centres are appropriately distributed in respect of urban densities and walkable catchments, opportunities for well-planned medium-density residential development in appropriate locations, and they may well assist affordability also. Suitable connectivity to the Raglan land, Company land to the south, which also forms part of the Tutuai, Afon, Potoro growth areas in Waikato 2070, noting that there is currently only one connection proposed. Furthermore, I consider the structure plan to be limited in its scope by adherence to cadastral boundaries in a way that could lead to poor urban and rural interface outcomes. I also consider growth of the scale proposed should involve stakeholder, particularly Tainui, Awhiro and wider community engagement in terms of the spatial structure of growth and associated social, cultural and environmental outcomes. These steps were undertaken to inform the previous Raglan Rangatahi Peninsula private plan change with extensive community workshops and comprehensive engagement with Tainui, Awhiro. I also consider the Raglan Peninsula to be somewhat of a special case due to its distinctive peninsula landform characteristics. The peninsula landform by its nature is separate and could to some extent, given its Opotoro Road bridge connection, be considered in isolation as a distinctive and somewhat standalone growth cell. The Koning to Tutuai lands, or indeed the western growth areas of Raglan as a whole, do not have the benefit of this isolation and should, in my opinion, be the subject of a comprehensive high-level spatial plan prior to more detailed structure planning and live zoning. So the FUZ, therefore, in my opinion, is appropriate for these areas as recommended in the Section 42 report, and I suggest that. And I just reinforce the evidence of Mr. Inga in terms of the amendments to policy 4118 in terms of recognising the spatial planning in the district plan. So that's my summary, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks very much, Mr. Lambert. Let's start with you, Ms. Gibb.
And nothing from me, thank you.
Ms. Tiaho?
No, thank you very much for your presentation.
Mr. Fulton?
Yeah, no questions, but thank you for the presentation.
Ms. Sedgwick?
I have no questions. That was very interesting, and thank you for the comprehensive detail in it as well.
Mr. Marg?
No, nothing from me, but thank you for your presentation.
Mr. Cooney?
Mr. Lambert, we don't know when a spatial plan will be done, do we? We can't direct it. It's a matter for council to fund and to promote. Do you accept that?
Yeah, I guess that's sort of a bit outside of my remit, but yes, I mean, I can agree with that. I think though, what I've identified is that a lot of the work that council would need to do to put that spatial plan in, or to do the spatial planning work, a lot of that has been done. So it's not a coming cold to the process. And so I think that, you know, it's not likely to take a tremendous amount of time, and I would agree with Mr. Inga's identification that there's no reason why that couldn't be in place by, you know, within a couple of years.
We don't know when, do we? You don't know when, I don't know when. So we could get a situation
for the next 5 years, we've got no spatial plan, even longer. And so while that situation occurs, we've got only one land supplier in the whole of Raglan. That doesn't give a heck of a lot of choice in the marketplace, does it?
Well, it's not my understanding that there is only one land supplier in Raglan. And, you know, I think the thing is that planning should follow a good sequence, and, you know, you shouldn't just be pushed to pursue a demand outcome without doing the planning that should be in place to achieve a good outcome from growth. Because Raglan, we've all agreed, is special, and it deserves a little bit of time to get the planning right, in my opinion, to ensure that the growth that does occur reinforces the qualities that everybody admires about Raglan and secures a long-term outcome of growth, which seeks to, you know, achieve good environmental as well as other character and, you know, other social and cultural values as well.
The only other real opportunities for greenfield developments, or could be brownfield, is the medium density zone, if that goes ahead, and that's going to take years too to implement that. So so this push for the spatial plan by Rangatahi, it's almost sort of, you know, almost getting dangerously close to sort of a trade competition, isn't it?
So that's a question for me, if you want to ask that question. And I've already addressed that in submissions. No, sir, I've addressed that in submission. There's 4 areas of land identified in my submissions that in different land ownership that make land available. So it's not just the Rangatahi Peninsula, and I've made that point really clearly, and it's not correct to suggest otherwise. Strongly reject that.
And I think, in fact, the reporting planner identified those areas in her own maps to begin with today as well. So I think that it's not the case that there is just one landowner, and yeah.
All right, thank you.
I don't have any questions, thank you. I think it's clear enough where your analysis leads. So thank you very much, Mr. Lambert.
Thank you.
I just check with the panel. Mr. Lambert's evidence, as foreshadowed, links pretty closely to the next witness, Mr. Lunday. Do you want to take a break, or do you think it makes sense to continue and hear this whole sort of tranche, as it were, before we break? I'm inclined to continue.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Does any of the panel have a problem with that?
Sir, if it's any help, sir, Mr. Lundy and I have had a chat, and he thinks that he can truncate his presentation by just directing it to questions that have already been asked.
Well, we don't want to cut across. We're not trying to short circuit what he wants to tell us. We're happy with that if you're happy with that.
Yes, sir. I mean, it's to avoid repetition.
Okay. All right. Well, let's proceed to hear from Mr. Lunday, and he can tell us what he wants to tell us, and then we'll see if we've got any questions.
We get the presentation. I will follow my presentation quickly and stop at ones that I think are relevant. Kia ora, my name is James Lundy. I'm an urban designer, architect and planner, but I practice urban design mainly. I've worked closely with Rachel de Lambert on the Rangatahi Peninsula project since the beginning. I've also worked with Rachel on other projects as well. And I agree with her summary evidence that she put up. So there's no real point in me going through that. So if I'm going to focus on what I think are some of the major questions that have been asked, and particularly from Paul about the need or the, and also from Mr. Mitchell about the need. Dr. Mitchell, oh, there's lots of doctors around here. I have got a pain in the lower back, if that's in, can sort that out.
Concentrate and give them your evidence.
Okay. So if we actually go to the second slide quickly, we have all agreed Raglan is special, but let's go to the next slide, because I think this gets to the core of the issue for me about spatial planning. Spatial planning, to me, isn't two-dimensional. Spatial planning includes multi-dimensions, includes social, cultural, economic, and something else that you can't really put your finger on, that in urban design called genius loci, which is the spirit of place. And that is what makes places special, not just Raglan. And I actually think every settlement deserves good spatial planning, not just special settlements. And you could say that non-special settlements need better spatial planning to make them special. So if you actually look at that image, that is a photo not of somewhere in Bangladesh, but somewhere in Raglan. And that's inappropriate infill. So a spatial plan wouldn't just take into account the fuzz areas, it's actually looking at the core essence of Raglan and where and why and how development happens. I actually don't care how much, whether it's 800, whether it's 1,000, whether it's 10,000, whether it's 20,000, it should all be driven by good spatial planning. Now, I'll give one example of where that wasn't followed, 1991-92, which dates me quite a lot, that I was engaged along with other people to do a spatial plan for Queenstown. The next incoming council decided to abandon that, and we all know what happened with Queenstown without a decent spatial plan, and now they're trying to catch up on it. So it was something which is essential to the growth of a town if you want it to be a healthy place to live, a healthy environment, a good place to live, work and play. So the threat is without that level of spatial planning, without that higher level of policies and objectives, then the structure plans can end up inadequate and not integrated. Next slide, maybe see what it is. So the opportunity is to ensure that the growth of Raglan is in alignment with the character and qualities. That doesn't mean replicating the historic growth. It means replicating the rationale and the reasons that make Raglan special. And that's what we attempted to do in the Rangitahi Peninsula. It wasn't to replicate the historic town, but to create the conditions that made people like and want to live or relocate their businesses or their families to Raglan. Next slide. So the development responses must promote the environment and support the character. So it's about settlement pattern, cultural values, multimodal connectivity, critical mass to support small-scale commercial activity, not just putting all the pressure on the existing commercial centre to accommodate business and service industries for these neighbourhoods, because they are disparate, they are outside walking distance and cycling distance, some of them. And if we want to reduce the amount of internal commuting, then we also need to do that. That can only be done within a spatial planning exercise that looks at the economics of the whole area and the demands of that whole area and the changing nature of how we work, shop and play. Next slide. Now, I think that I'm now going to talk about the Rangitahi Peninsula. I was also involved with the Peacock structure plan and the more detailed structure planning that came that was part of the Peacock family one. So I have got a history with the family, and I will say in 30 years of working here, it would be foolish, in my opinion, to rely on developers and landowners to do good quality spatial and strategic planning, because they're like hen's teeth. I can count the number of times I've had clients that are willing to go that extra mile on one hand, over 30 years of being an urban designer, working in the private sector. So that is why it has to be a district-wide spatial planning exercise that engages the major landowners and the community and the iwi in that process. Next slide. So the patterns of growth in Raglan. So we'll move on to the next slides after that. The lovely old photo of Raglan when it basically was two communities separated by a stream and estuary. So the next slide will start to show some of the patterns of growth. So in my opinion, the 1860s area was well planned, it's well connected because of technology, because of demand, because people lived in smaller houses, because they didn't have sewage system, because they didn't have machinery to dig into the banks. You have small footprints sitting in fairly large sections on the topography. The topography hasn't been disturbed. So you end up with what is a relatively intensive development sitting within a canopy of trees. That 1860s area needs to be protected and preserved. So therefore, although this isn't the purpose of my evidence today, I think the Kāinga Ora approach to it is a generic approach that is being applied throughout the country by KO, regardless of the qualities of that area. But the one thing you need to protect is your historic cores. So therefore, there is a limit to the amount of intensification that I would support in there, and there has to be a very high qualitative level attached to that. That can only be done through a spatial plan and the objectives and policies that come out of the spatial plan to direct it, design guidelines, character studies, all these other things. And you can see from these maps, even with the Rangitahi Peninsula, that up until now, the releases on the whole of development, 1860s, 1920s, 1940s, right up to today, have been comprehensively planned. But within that, there's a lot of ad hoc subdivision and development that's happened in infill, which detracts from the development of it. So in many ways, the attempt that we had, and I was one of the original master planners, along with Rachel on Rangitahi, was not to replicate 1860, 1920, 1940, but to take the essence that people liked in Raglan and deliver it. And I think David's slides showed that that's being delivered, which is the benefit of having one comprehensive piece of land, well planned down to a minutiae of detail and delivered by one committed landowner. Next slide. We can move on because I've said that now. There is a plan, there always was a plan. So growth has to be responsive to character. It cannot be done in isolation by individual landowners who stick to cadastral boundaries. And it needs more comprehensive planning if we've to resolve some of the issues that we've heard today, such as getting more employment in the area, developing higher density. Higher density is the only way to really reduce the costs of land because developing land is so expensive. So therefore, having simplistic subdivision plans, all delivering 450 square metre sections in one area, does not provide for a mixture of typologies and housing types that either suits a changing population or delivers affordable housing mixed in an integrated community. So next slide. And so that is a typical view of housing set within landscape, within the existing town. We go to the next slide. And then the next one, placemaking. The Rangitahi Peninsula is in excess of 120 hectares. We go to the next slide. These were the principles of growth that we developed for the Rangitahi Peninsula for Raglan. We didn't just do them for the Rangitahi Peninsula. We developed our own spatial plan. We developed our own internal objectives and policies and our own direction of travel. That is fine if you've got a well-funded, large piece of land with a committed landowner, but it's very rare to get that. That needs to be applied to the area as whole. It doesn't need to take a long time. It's something that council should move on. And I have been involved in other towns, particularly in South Island, where major landowners have been willing to commit either resources or finances or consultants to do a joint spatial plan for these communities. So there are ways forward, and they may be not something that can be totally directed by the hearing, but it's something that the councillors can take back to council and make it a priority. So it needn't take 5 years. But what the economic studies have shown, in my opinion, even if it does, we have sufficient land to do that over 5 years. And it's more important, 5 years is a blip in the history of Raglan, and it's a blip in the history of New Zealand that goes much deeper and longer than Raglan. Next slide. Next one. This is just a snippet of the master plan, and some of you might not have seen it. We didn't just do an outline development plan or a structure plan for Rangitahi. We future cast into a detailed master plan which had typologies and various sizes of sections. It had centres, community centres, it had retail and commercial centres, and we actually designed it to quite a high level of detail, and then we stripped it back. Now, what we're starting to see, if we move to the next slide, we anticipated intensification. This is just a watercolour I did, so it's not an actual design, and don't worry about the architecture, but we anticipated intensification within Rangitahi as it developed and the market developed. What my experience has been in urban design in New Zealand and Australia is that as the area becomes more desirable, if you put the right planning and the right infrastructure in place and the right amenity in place, over time, people will accept more intensive development, smaller sites, even apartments in areas that they wouldn't have taken at the beginning. So therefore, when you have a structure plan, it's about phasing that development and phasing your intensity. Next slide. And as has been said, it is starting to happen. There's a distinct architectural style now starting to develop within Rangitahi. There is, proposals to do apartments, or proposals to do more different types of typologies. So it's actually happening. So as we planned it, as it's being delivered. And that's when I came into planning about 100 years ago, that it was about planning. It wasn't about a set of abstract rules and subdivision. It was about planning in 4 dimensions that includes culture and community, economics, infrastructure, typologies, buildings, and landscape. Next one. And that was just showing, I don't need to do that. David's been through that perfectly, but you can see why people will move there and why, given the chance, they now would take a small compact house on a small site, or maybe even an apartment, if that's all they can afford in that community, because they have got amenity. Next slide. Now, Rachel has gone over that. Now, what I would say is when we were doing Rangitahi Peninsula, we also looked wider. So this is actually totally in accordance with where we were, but we weren't convinced that the market was there for that amount of land. So we pulled it back to what could. Now, the areas that have been identified for future growth haven't been looked at in the level of detail that the rest of the peninsula was. But as Rachel has shown you in her presentation, the background information is there, and it was quite easy for her and her company to drill in to get more levels of information in there. So spatial planning in Raglan needn't take too long. In fact, it needn't take too long in any community. Next slide. So again, like the other submissions and the other professionals, the natural growth area, because of topography and because of land ownership and because of cultural values, tends to sit to the west and the south of the existing town of Raglan, across the estuary and the harbour. And so therefore, it has long been identified as an area for growth. What hasn't happened is the level of detail that ensures that that growth happens in an integrated manner with the rest of the town, and that the qualities in the existing town aren't sacrificed to growth by ad hoc intensification, exceeding height levels and within the historic town, expanding the commercial area of the existing town, and various other things that can really only be looked at in detail in a proper spatial planning exercise, which we have probably gone halfway through previously doing the Rangatahi Peninsula. But the rest of the town looks at. We did also do a character study as part of that original submission as well. And we did that in conjunction with the community through workshops. And I think that's basically what I've got to say. And I'll just open it for questions now.
Thank you. Let's see if there are any questions. Mr. Mayo?
No, thank you for that, but no questions.
Ms. Sedgwick?
Can I just ask a quick question? And you just mentioned just then about workshops and about the special character of Raglan. Was that in with conjunction with the community groups in Raglan as well?
Yes.
Raglan naturally?
Yes, it had, and it was in, I can't remember, we were in one of the halls in Raglan, and we had, yeah, it was good. And it was a time when you were going through also issues on sewage, what kind of sewage scheme you should have. I seem to remember a young man called Nandor Tandus was there as well. And that's what I'm saying. It's a special community. It's not just about preserving the physical entity of Raglan. It's almost a spiritual entity of Raglan. It has attracted a particular community, and the wrong kind of planning can drive that community out. Therefore, it ends up like Omaha, you know, or I dare to hate to say it because I've been involved in it, and it looks like it's going the wrong way, Mangawhai. Where they become sort of like, you don't want to become Hamilton by the sea. No offense to Hamilton, but Hamilton is Hamilton. And Raglan is internationally recognized, probably not because of the landscape of the built form, but a combination of that and the surfing and the kind of community that's gone there. It's a special community, not just a special environment, and spatial planning isn't just a two-dimensional land use exercise. It takes in all these other components, and that hasn't been done extensively, in my opinion.
Yes, I noticed you focused on that a lot. Thank you very much for your answer.
Thank you, Ms. Gibb.
No, nothing from me, thank you.
Mr. Fulton?
Just a question, not so much on landscaping, but I'll ask it and someone may choose to answer. We've heard so much about the structure planning and the necessity for it. And we also heard from the councillors this morning to say they're struggling with a 10-year plan, not enough money available for all the jobs that are required and all those sorts of things. And we're talking about wanting to get a structure plan done in the next couple of years. There's a considerable cost in doing these things, and whether it may be a question for Mr. Peacock, but the shared cost of the two blocks that have been urban expansion zones, fuzz areas, would they be prepared to make a contribution towards the cost of this plan?
James signalled that developers have done that, and I've just had an indication from Mr. Peacock that he would be prepared to help fund that.
Thank you. That's my question. Thank you.
And bearing in mind there's a lot of work that's already been done, and he's indicating that he would put resources into completing that.
Thank you.
Ms. Teaho?
No questions from me, thank you.
Mr. Cooney?
No, thank you.
No, and I don't have any questions either. Thank you very much. I think we'll break for lunch. We'll resume at 1:45. We've still got 3, I believe, witnesses for Rangatahi to conclude, and then we'll progress from that on to the Koning Family Trust matters. You'll just need to log off from this call, and there's a separate link for the session for the afternoon, please. So we'll adjourn now till 1:45.
Thank you, sir.